Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Something was wrong with the silence here. It pressed against my eardrums like cotton soaked in dread, thick and suffocating in a way that natural quiet never should be. The isolation I'd craved for my writing retreat had transformed into something malevolent the moment I stepped out of my car and felt the weight of unseen eyes watching from the tree line. The cottage rental had seemed perfect online, remote enough to escape the city's constant noise, yet close enough to civilization that I wouldn't lose my mind to complete solitude. Or so I'd thought. Now, standing in the overgrown driveway with my laptop bag slung over my shoulder, I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. The owner had been odd during our brief phone conversation, his voice crackling through what sounded like an ancient landline. He'd mentioned something about previous tenants leaving early, though he'd brushed off my questions about why. The keys would be under the loose stone by the front door, he'd said, and I was welcome to stay as long as I needed. No need for him to drive out and meet me in person. I should have pressed for more details. The house itself appeared solid enough, if weathered. 2 stories of faded clapboard siding, with shutters that hung at slightly wrong angles, and a roof that sagged in the middle like a tired smile. Ivy crawled up the eastern wall in thick, dark veins, and several windows stared out at me with the blank expression of cataracts. But it was the smell that hit me first when I unlocked the front door, a musty sweetness that reminded me of flowers left too long in stagnant water. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of late-afternoon sunlight that struggled through grimy windows. The furniture was old but functional, covered in sheets that I pulled away to reveal worn leather and faded fabric. Everything had the feel of a place that had been waiting, not abandoned, but expectant, as if holding its breath for something to happen. I spent the first hour getting settled, carrying my bags upstairs to the master bedroom and setting up my laptop on the kitchen table. The Wi-Fi was spotty, which was actually perfect for my purposes. No distractions from social media or email. Just me, my manuscript, and the oppressive quiet that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. It wasn't until I stepped outside to get some air that I noticed the well. It sat in the backyard like a mouth frozen mid-scream, roughly 20 feet from the house. A circular stone structure about 4 feet high, topped with a wooden cover that looked hastily constructed. Thick planks had been nailed across the opening in an X pattern, with additional boards layered on top. Someone had really wanted to keep it sealed. My chest tightened as I approached it. The stones were dark with age and moisture, covered in patches of moss that felt slimy under my fingertips. Strange symbols had been carved into several of the stones, not letters or numbers, but twisted shapes that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The wood covering creaked softly in the evening breeze, a sound like old bones settling. I told myself it was just an old well, probably unsafe and properly covered for liability reasons. But something about it made the hair on my arms stand up. The air around it felt colder, and there was an odd smell. Not quite decay, but something organic and wrong, like milk left out too long in summer heat. That first night I tried to focus on my writing. The story I'd been working on for months had stalled, and I'd hoped the change of scenery would unlock whatever creative block was holding me back. But every time I sat down at the laptop, my eyes kept drifting to the back windows, to the dark shape of the well visible in the moonlight. The scratching started around midnight. At first I thought it was mice in the walls or branches scraping against the siding. But as I lay in bed listening, the sound became more distinct. It wasn't random. There was a rhythm to it, a deliberate quality that suggested intent rather than accident. Scratch, scratch, pause, scratch, scratch, pause. Like something trying to claw its way out of confinement. My heart began to hammer against my ribs as I realized the sound was coming from outside, from the direction of the well. I pressed my face to the bedroom window, cupping my hands around my eyes to block the reflection. The backyard was bathed in pale moonlight, shadows stretching long and dark across the overgrown grass. The well sat in its circle of newer darkness, the wooden cover barely visible. but I could hear it clearly now. The steady scraping of something against stone, echoing up from deep underground. The sound made my teeth ache and sent cold tendrils crawling up my spine. Whatever was down there, it was trying to get out. Sleep became impossible. I paced the bedroom floor, my bare feet silent on the worn hardwood, while the scratching continued below. Sometimes it would stop for long minutes, leaving only the oppressive silence, and I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Then it would start again, more frantic than before, and my pulse would spike with renewed terror. By 3 a.m, curiosity had overwhelmed fear. I had to know what was making that sound. I crept downstairs and out the back door, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn around and go back inside. The night air was cold against my skin, raising goosebumps along my arms and legs. The scratching grew louder as I approached the well, accompanied now by what sounded almost like whispers, too faint to make out words, but with the cadence of urgent conversation. My hands shook as I examined the wooden cover. The boards were old but sturdy, held in place by rusty nails that had been driven deep into the stone. But at the edges, where the wood met the stone rim, I could see gaps, thin lines of absolute darkness that seemed to pulse with their own malevolent life. A thin stream of mist was seeping through one of these gaps. Not steam, but something that moved with purpose, blue-tinged and luminescent in the moonlight. It curled upward like reaching fingers, dissipating slowly into the night air. The moment I saw it, the whispering became clearer. Not words exactly, but something that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to my brain. Images flashed behind my eyes, glimpses of things that had been lost, hidden, stolen. A locket with a woman's photograph, a child's toy soldier, a leather-bound journal filled with spidery handwriting, and underneath it all, a desperate hunger, a need so profound it made my chest ache with sympathetic longing. They wanted something back, something that belonged to them, something that had been taken and hidden away. And somehow, impossibly, they knew I could help them find it. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. But the mist followed me, tendrils of blue light wrapping around my ankles like ghostly shackles. The whispers grew more insistent, and new images flooded my mind. The interior of the house, rooms I hadn't yet explored, hidden spaces behind walls and under floorboards. Whatever they were looking for, it was inside. I ran back to the house, slamming the door behind me and throwing the deadbolt. But I could still feel them out there, pressing against the windows and walls, their need radiating through the night like heat from a fever. The whispers followed me inside, echoing through the empty rooms and crawling under my skin. The next few hours passed in a haze of terror and compulsion. I found myself moving through the house as if sleepwalking, my hands exploring surfaces and corners, while my conscious mind screamed at me to stop. In the basement, behind a loose stone in the foundation, my fingers found the edge of something wrapped in oiled cloth. The locket was exactly as I'd seen in the visions, tarnished silver on a broken chain, containing the photograph of a young woman with sad eyes. But there were other things too, hidden in various locations throughout the house. The toy soldier tucked behind a beam in the attic, the journal sealed in a metal box beneath the kitchen floorboards, and more. Dozens of small personal items, each one radiating the same desperate longing I'd felt from the well. Someone had collected these things, stolen them, perhaps, or simply failed to return them to their proper owners. And now those owners, or what remained of them, wanted them back. The blue mist had followed me inside, seeping through cracks in the windows and under doors. It pooled in corners and drifted across the ceiling, and wherever it touched, the temperature dropped by several degrees. My breath came out in small puffs of vapor, and frost began to form on the inside of the windows. But it wasn't just the cold that made me shiver. The whispers had become clearer, more urgent. Dawn was coming, I understood, and if I didn't return their belongings to the well before sunrise, something terrible would happen. The exact nature of that consequence remained unclear, but the fear that radiated from the mist told me everything I needed to know. I gathered the items in a canvas bag, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold them. Each object felt heavier than it should, weighted with years of separation and loss. The locket burned like ice against my palm, and the toy soldier seemed to move on its own. Its tiny painted face turned up toward me in mute accusation. Outside, the well waited. The wooden cover had partially come loose during the night, several boards now hanging at odd angles. The opening beneath was a circle of perfect blackness, so deep that my phone's flashlight couldn't penetrate more than a few feet down. But I could hear movement down there, not scratching now, but a soft susurrus like wind through dry leaves, or the whisper of fabric against stone. I approached the edge with my bag of stolen treasures, every instinct screaming at me to turn and run. But the blue mist swirled around me now, thick as fog, and I could feel their gratitude already beginning to replace the desperate hunger. These things would go back where they belonged. The cycle would be completed. One by one, I dropped the items into the darkness. The locket fell with a tiny splash, as if it had landed in water far below. The toy soldier tumbled end over end before disappearing into the void. The journal fluttered like a dying bird before being swallowed by shadows. With each offering, the whispers grew softer, more content. The blue mist began to dissipate, sinking back through the gaps in the wooden cover and flowing down into the depths like reverse smoke. The temperature around the well started to return to normal, and the oppressive weight that had been pressing on my chest all night finally began to lift. But as I turned to go back inside, one final whisper reached me, clearer than all the rest, spoken in a voice that might once have belonged to the woman in the locket. "Thank you," it said, "but he knows you've been here. He knows what you've done." The words hit me like ice water in my veins. He, the owner, I realized, the man who'd rented me this place, who'd made sure to stay away while I was here. He'd known about the well, about the things hidden in the house, and somehow he'd known that someone like me would eventually come along, someone curious enough to investigate, sympathetic enough to return what had been taken. I'd been set up, used, and now he would know that his carefully hoarded collection had been discovered and destroyed. Dawn was breaking as I threw my belongings into my car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. In the pale morning light, the house looked different. Not just old and weathered, but malevolent, like a predator that had been temporarily satisfied, but would soon be hungry again. As I pulled out of the driveway, I caught one last glimpse of the well in my rearview mirror. The wooden cover had fallen completely away during the night, leaving the opening exposed. But instead of the darkness I expected to see, there was only ordinary stone and shadow. The depths of an old water well, nothing more. The whispers were gone. The blue mist had vanished. But I knew with cold certainty that this wasn't over. The man who owned this place would return, would discover what I'd done, and would begin collecting again. There would be other renters, other curious visitors who stumbled upon his hidden treasures and felt compelled to investigate. And somewhere, in other dark places, other voices would begin to whisper their desperate pleas into the night. I drove until I reached the main highway, then kept driving until the sun was high and hot, and the memory of that terrible cold had faded from my bones. But even now, weeks later, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night with the taste of frost on my tongue and the echo of grateful whispers in my ears. I never finished my manuscript. Some stories, I've learned, are better left unwritten. Story 2. The basement reeked of mildew and decades-old dust. But beneath that familiar mustiness lurked something else. Something that made my nostrils flare with an inexplicable dread. The single bare bulb cast sickly yellow light across rows of vinyl records, their spines creating a maze of shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I'd been collecting records for 15 years, hunting through estate sales, thrift stores, and underground dealers for those rare gems that made my pulse quicken. But standing in that cramped basement beneath Henderson's Antiques, staring at the unmarked album sleeve that contained nothing but a black vinyl disc, I felt something I'd never experienced before, the absolute certainty that I shouldn't take it home. I bought it anyway. The decision felt disconnected from my rational mind, as if my hand moved independently when I placed the $20 bill on Henderson's grimy palm. He didn't meet my eyes, just mumbled something about it being part of an estate lot he'd acquired from a house upstate. The way his fingers trembled slightly as he wrapped the record in brown paper should have been warning enough. My apartment felt different when I returned that evening. The familiar comfort of my listening room, walls lined with carefully organized albums, my vintage turntable setup gleaming under warm lamplight, seemed somehow diminished. The shadows in the corners appeared deeper, more persistent. Even my cat, Hendrix, who normally greeted me with purrs and ankle rubs, remained hidden beneath the couch, his yellow eyes reflecting the lamplight like tiny warning beacons. I unwrapped the record with the reverence I reserved for my most precious finds, but my hands shook more than usual. The vinyl itself was pristine, almost impossibly so, as if it had never been played. No label adorned its center, just smooth black plastic that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The weight felt wrong, too, heavier than any record should be, as though something dense and unknowable had been pressed into its grooves along with the music. The first time I played it, nothing happened. Nothing, that is, except for the static. It wasn't the warm crackle of vintage vinyl or the gentle hiss of analog recording. This static felt aggressive, purposeful, like white noise that had developed consciousness and malevolent intent. I adjusted the tracking, cleaned the stylus, checked every connection in my meticulously maintained system. The static persisted, filling my apartment with a sound that made my teeth ache and my skin crawl. But I couldn't stop listening. Night after night, I found myself drawn back to that record. The static began to reveal patterns, subtle rhythms buried beneath the chaos, almost like voices speaking just below the threshold of comprehension. I'd lean closer to the speakers, straining to make sense of the sounds, until my eyes watered and my temples throbbed from the concentration. It was during the fourth session that I first heard my name. The sound emerged from the static like a drowning person breaking the surface of water, desperate, gasping, undeniably real. My name, spoken in a voice I didn't recognize but somehow knew intimately. The shock sent me stumbling backward, my chair toppling as I fought to reach the turntable and lift the needle. But the voice continued even after the stylus left the groove. My throat constricted as the realization hit me. The sound was coming from inside my head now, or perhaps it had been all along. The voice, dry, papery, like autumn leaves scraping across concrete, began to speak with painful clarity about things I'd never told anyone. Childhood secrets, embarrassing moments from high school, the real reason I'd quit my job 3 years ago instead of the noble excuse I'd fed everyone. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed eyes, the voice would whisper in my ear, recounting episodes from my life with forensic precision. It knew about the $20 I'd stolen from my mother's purse when I was 12. It knew about the girl I'd humiliated in college out of my own insecurity. It knew about the hit-and-run accident I'd witnessed but never reported because I'd been too cowardly to get involved. The worst part wasn't the violation of privacy. It was the accuracy. Every detail, every nuance, every shameful thought I'd buried deep was laid bare with surgical precision. By the second week, the voice had company. New voices joined the chorus, each one attached to a secret, each one speaking with that same papery authority. They whispered simultaneously, creating a cacophony of confessions that made my skull feel like it might crack open from the pressure. I stopped eating regularly, forgot to shower, let bills pile up unopened on my kitchen counter. The outside world became irrelevant compared to the horrifying intimacy of these spectral conversations. I tried throwing the record away, but it always reappeared. In my collection, on my turntable, sometimes just sitting on my kitchen table like an accusation. I attempted to break it, but my hands refused to obey. They'd shake and freeze whenever I tried to bring a hammer down on the vinyl. The voices began to manifest physically during the third week. It started with cold spots in my apartment, areas where the temperature dropped 20 degrees for no apparent reason. Then came the shadows that moved independently of any light source, sliding across walls and pooling in corners like spilled ink. My peripheral vision caught constant movement, shapes darting between furniture, figures standing just outside doorways that vanished when I turned to look directly. Hendrix stopped eating and spent his days pressed against the front door, occasionally letting out low, mournful yowls that sounded almost human. Dark circles formed under my eyes, and my reflection in the bathroom mirror looked increasingly gaunt and hollow. My hands developed a persistent tremor that made holding anything difficult. The worst moment came on a Tuesday evening when I arrived home to find every light in my apartment turned off except for the lamp above my turntable. The record was spinning at the wrong speed, too slow, creating a warped, demonic version of the static that seemed to be laughing at me. As I approached to shut it off, the shadows in the room began to coalesce into vaguely human shapes. They stood around my listening room like an audience, their forms shifting and uncertain, but undeniably present. I could feel their attention like physical weight pressing against my chest, making each breath a struggle. The temperature plummeted until I could see my own breath fogging in the suddenly Arctic air. That's when they spoke in unison, their collective voice loud enough to rattle the windows. They demanded an explanation I couldn't provide. They wanted to know why I'd hidden these secrets, why I'd lived a lie, why I deserved to keep these shameful truths buried while others suffered the consequences of my cowardice and selfishness. Their questions came like physical blows, each one driving me to my knees as guilt and terror warred in my chest. I tried to scream, but no sound emerged from my throat. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. The shadows pressed closer, their whispered accusations becoming a roar that threatened to shatter my sanity completely. Then, in that moment of absolute desperation, I understood. The record wasn't cursed. It was a mirror. The voices weren't supernatural entities demanding judgment. They were fragments of my own conscience that I'd suppressed for decades. Every shameful secret, every buried guilt, every moment of moral cowardice had been compressed into this vinyl repository of my own making. The manifestations weren't ghosts. They were the psychic weight of a lifetime of unacknowledged wrongs, given form by my own guilt and self-loathing. The revelation hit me like ice water, shocking and clarifying. I forced myself to stand, legs trembling, and walked slowly to the turntable. The shadows followed but didn't interfere as I lifted the needle and removed the record from the platter. But instead of hiding it away again, I did something I'd never done before. I spoke directly to those assembled shadows, acknowledging each secret they'd revealed. I admitted my cowardice, my selfishness, my casual cruelties. I spoke until my voice was raw, until tears ran down my cheeks, until the weight in my chest began to lighten fractionally. The shadows didn't disappear immediately, but as I continued talking, really talking, not just listening to their accusations, they began to fade. The temperature slowly returned to normal. The oppressive atmosphere that had choked my apartment for weeks started to dissipate like smoke. When morning came, I was alone, except for Hendrix, who cautiously emerged from beneath the couch and approached me with tentative purrs. The record lay on my coffee table, no longer threatening but not exactly benign either. It had returned to being just vinyl and grooves, but I knew it would always carry the weight of what it had shown me. I never played it again, but I kept it. Not as a trophy or curiosity, but as a reminder. Some secrets are too heavy to carry alone, and some truths too important to bury. The voices had been right about one thing. I owed explanations, not to them, but to the real people I'd wronged over the years. The process of making those amends took months. Some conversations went better than others. Some people slammed doors in my face. But with each confession, each apology, each attempt to right old wrongs, the record seemed to grow lighter on my shelf. Sometimes late at night, I still catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, but now they feel less like accusations and more like reminders, gentle nudges toward honesty in a world that makes it easy to hide from uncomfortable truths. The static hasn't returned, but I know it's still there, waiting beneath the surface of every choice I make. The difference now is that I'm listening. Story 3. The silence between what you think you see and what you know you've seen is where terror lives. In that breathless moment when your mind struggles to reconcile the impossible with the undeniable. The brass key felt heavier than it should have when Mrs. Blackwood pressed it into my palm 3 days ago. She'd explained that the Rosemore estate needed a caretaker while she and her husband traveled to Europe for 6 weeks, and my reputation for maintaining difficult gardens had reached them through mutual acquaintances. The pay was generous, suspiciously so, but I needed the money, and tending to a century-old garden seemed like peaceful work compared to my usual clients' suburban lawns. I should have asked why they couldn't find anyone local. The estate sat at the end of a winding gravel road, surrounded by towering oaks that formed a natural barrier between the property and the outside world. The main house was a Victorian monstrosity of dark stone and twisted iron, but it was the garden that took my breath away. Acres of meticulously maintained flower beds, topiary mazes, and winding stone paths created an intricate tapestry of botanical artistry. And scattered throughout this green paradise, like sentinels frozen in time, stood dozens of marble statues. Each figure was carved with exquisite detail. Roman gods and goddesses, mythical creatures, children at play, elegant ladies in flowing gowns. They were positioned seemingly at random, a satyr leering from behind a rose bush, a weeping angel beside a fountain, a proud warrior guarding a garden gate. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, so lifelike that I found myself doing double takes, expecting to catch subtle movements in my peripheral vision. Mrs. Blackwood had mentioned that the statues were original to the property, installed by the estate's first owner in the 1890s. She'd said this with a slight tremor in her voice that I'd attributed to age, but now, standing among these silent witnesses, I wondered if there had been something more behind her unease. My first day passed uneventfully. I pruned roses, dead-headed perennials, and checked the irrigation system. The work was meditative, almost hypnotic, and I found myself falling into a comfortable rhythm. The only disturbance was an odd sensation that I was being watched, but every time I turned to scan the garden, I saw nothing but marble faces staring blindly ahead. It was late afternoon when I first noticed it, a statue of a young woman in classical drapery that I could have sworn was facing the fountain when I'd walked past earlier. Now she seemed to be angled slightly toward the path where I stood. The difference was subtle, perhaps only a few degrees, but my eye for spatial relationships had been honed by years of landscape design. I stood there for several minutes, studying her serene expression, trying to convince myself that my memory was playing tricks. That night, alone in the caretaker's cottage at the edge of the property, I lay awake listening to the wind move through the oak branches. Occasionally, I heard what sounded like footsteps on gravel, but when I looked out the window, the moonlit garden appeared empty and still. The second day brought stronger suspicions. A marble faun that had been positioned near the herb garden now stood closer to the main path. A Roman senator who had previously faced east was now looking north. I began taking mental notes, creating a map in my mind of each statue's position and orientation. By evening, I was certain that at least 6 figures had shifted since morning. The rational part of my mind searched for explanations. Ground settling, perhaps, or expansion and contraction due to temperature changes. But marble statues weighing hundreds of pounds don't simply rotate on their pedestals, and the movements seemed too purposeful, too coordinated, as if following some invisible choreography. My sleep that second night was fitful, punctuated by dreams of stone fingers scratching against glass and marble eyes that tracked my movements. I woke several times, heart pounding, convinced I'd heard voices whispering in a language I couldn't understand. Each time I checked the windows, the garden lay bathed in silver moonlight, peaceful and motionless. By the third day, my unease had crystallized into something approaching fear. The statues were definitely moving, not just shifting slightly, but relocating entirely. A cherub that had adorned the fountain's edge was now positioned near the cottage's front gate. A goddess of hunting stood where a philosopher had been the day before. The changes were happening when I wasn't looking, during those moments when I was focused on my work, or had my back turned. I began to test my theory, marking positions with small stones and taking photographs with my phone. The evidence was undeniable. These centuries-old marble figures were migrating through the garden like slow, silent pilgrims following an ancient route. The physical symptoms of fear began to manifest. My hands trembled as I worked, my mouth grew increasingly dry, and my heart hammered against my ribs whenever I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Cold sweat beaded on my forehead despite the warm afternoon sun. I found myself spinning around constantly, trying to catch them in the act, but they remained motionless whenever my gaze fell directly upon them. That afternoon, I noticed they were all facing the same direction, toward the main house. Not randomly positioned anymore, but oriented like compass needles pointing toward magnetic north. Their marble eyes, once scattered in different directions, now stared with collective intensity at the Victorian mansion's imposing facade. As sunset approached, I retreated to the cottage, my nerves frayed and my confidence shattered. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, knowing it was futile. What barrier could stop beings that moved through space without showing any sign of physical effort? I tried calling Mrs. Blackwood's number, but it went straight to voicemail. She'd mentioned they'd be traveling through remote areas with limited cell service. Sleep was impossible. I sat by the window, watching the garden through a gap in the curtains, my body rigid with tension. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in sharp relief. For hours, nothing happened. The statues stood in their positions, silent and still, all facing the house like an audience waiting for a performance to begin. Then, sometime after midnight, they began to move. It was subtle at first, a slight shift here, a gentle rotation there. But gradually, their movements became more pronounced. I watched in horror as the entire collection of marble figures began a slow, synchronized migration. They didn't walk or slide. They simply moved, gliding across the grass and stone paths like pieces on a supernatural chessboard. My breathing became shallow and rapid as I observed their deliberate procession. They were forming a circle around the cottage, positioning themselves at regular intervals like soldiers surrounding a fortress. Each statue turned to face my small refuge, their carved features now visible in the moonlight, their empty eye sockets seeming to burn with invisible fire. The sensation of being watched intensified until it felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. My skin crawled with the certainty that dozens of unseeing eyes were focused on my hiding place. I tried to back away from the window, but my legs felt weak and unsteady. Cold sweat now drenched my shirt and my hands shook uncontrollably. For what felt like hours, we remained in this tableau, me huddled in the cottage, them standing vigil outside. Then, as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, something changed. As one, they turned away from the cottage and faced the dark woods that bordered the property's far edge. Their message was unmistakable. It was time to follow. I knew I had a choice. I could barricade myself inside until the Blackwoods returned, hoping that daylight would restore some semblance of normality, or I could step outside and discover what these ancient guardians wanted to show me. The decision came from a part of my mind I didn't recognize, a compulsion that felt both foreign and inevitable. My hand moved to the door handle without conscious command, and I found myself stepping into the pre-dawn chill. The statues remained motionless as I walked among them, but I could feel their presence like a current of electricity in the air. They had arranged themselves to form a path leading from the cottage toward the woods, creating a corridor of marble sentinels. My footsteps sounded unnaturally loud on the gravel, each crunch echoing off the stone figures. At the edge of the garden, where manicured lawn gave way to wild forest, I hesitated. The trees loomed ahead like a black wall, their branches forming a canopy so thick that no moonlight penetrated to the forest floor. But the statue's collective gaze urged me forward, and I found myself crossing the threshold into darkness. The path through the woods was barely visible, marked only by the absence of undergrowth and the occasional glimpse of worn stone. My eyes gradually adjusted to the gloom, allowing me to pick out details. Moss-covered rocks, twisted roots, and something else. More statues, older and more weathered than those in the garden, standing like forgotten markers along the trail. The deeper I went, the more I understood. This wasn't just a garden. It was the visible portion of something much larger, much older. The estate was built on ancient ground, and the statues weren't mere decorations. They were guardians, keepers of knowledge that predated the Victorian mansion by centuries. After what felt like miles, the path opened into a circular clearing. At its center stood a structure I couldn't immediately comprehend. Part altar, part sculpture, carved from the same dark stone as the house. It was covered in symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in my vision, defying my attempts to focus on their details. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't the first caretaker. This ritual, this midnight procession, had been repeated countless times over the decades. The statues were collecting witnesses, drawing them into the woods to show them something that human minds weren't meant to process. But instead of revelation, I felt only a profound sense of displacement, as if I'd stepped outside the normal flow of time and space. The forest around me seemed to pulse with an alien rhythm, and the symbols on the stone altar continued their hypnotic dance. I backed away from the clearing, my survival instincts finally overriding whatever compulsion had brought me there. The return journey felt endless, each step a battle against the sensation that I was being pulled back toward that impossible structure. The statues I passed seemed to watch my retreat with disappointment, their marble features more expressive than any carved stone should be. When I finally emerged from the woods, dawn was breaking over the garden. The statues had returned to their original positions, facing random directions once again, as if the night's events had never occurred. But I could see the truth now. They were always watching, always waiting, always ready to guide another unsuspecting caretaker into the heart of whatever ancient mystery lay hidden in those dark woods. I packed my things and left that morning, forfeiting my payment and breaking my contract. When Mrs. Blackwood called 2 days later to ask why I'd abandoned my post, I told her simply that the job wasn't what I'd expected. She accepted my explanation with what sounded like relief, as if she'd heard similar words from previous caretakers. Now, weeks later, I still wake at midnight with the sensation of marble eyes watching me through my bedroom window. I've moved across the state, taken a job at an urban landscaping firm, surrounded myself with the noise and light of city life. But I know the truth. Some things can't be left behind, and some knowledge, once gained, leaves marks that never fade. Sometimes, when I catch movement in my peripheral vision, I wonder if the statues have found me again. And sometimes, in the darkest part of my mind, I wonder if I want them to. Story 4. Yeah, the brass felt cold against my palm even before I knew what it would cost me. My sister had found the antique compass at some estate sale, tucked away in a dusty jewelry box alongside tarnished lockets and broken timepieces. She claimed it would be perfect for my hiking obsession, but the moment I held it, my skin prickled with an inexplicable unease. The needle trembled behind its glass face like a trapped insect, never quite settling, never quite still. I should have thrown it away that first night when it kept me awake, ticking with a rhythm that didn't match any clock in my house. 3 days later, I found myself on the Cascade Mountain Trail with the compass buried deep in my backpack, trying to forget its presence. The October air bit at my exposed skin, and the maple leaves crunched underfoot with the brittle sound of old bones. I'd been hiking this route for years, knew every switchback and stream crossing by heart, but something felt different today. The forest seemed denser, the shadows longer, as if the trees had grown closer together overnight. My breathing came in short puffs that dissipated too quickly in the thin air. The familiar landmarks looked somehow distorted, tilted at angles that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on them. A fallen log I'd used as a rest stop hundreds of times before now resembled something else entirely, something with limbs and joints that belonged to no tree I could name. The first time I checked my phone for the trail map, I noticed my hands were shaking. The GPS showed my location correctly, but the compass app spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. When I pulled out the antique compass, my throat constricted. The needle pointed steadily in a direction that defied every navigation principle I'd ever learned. It aimed deep into the dense forest, toward terrain I'd never explored, toward places that didn't exist on any map. My pulse hammered against my neck as I stared at the unwavering needle. I told myself it was just a broken instrument, probably damaged by age or magnetized by some random metal object. But my hands moved of their own accord, rotating the compass, tilting it, even shaking it. The needle never wavered. It pointed with absolute certainty toward something hidden in the wilderness. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings as I stepped off the marked trail. My boots sank into soft earth carpeted with decades of fallen leaves. Branches scraped against my jacket with sounds that resembled whispered conversations. The deeper I walked, the more the temperature seemed to drop, until my breath formed visible clouds despite the afternoon sun filtering through the canopy above. The compass needle pulled me forward like a leash. Every instinct told me to turn back, but my legs kept moving, pushing through undergrowth that grew increasingly dense. Thorns caught at my clothes, leaving tiny tears that stung against my skin. The forest floor became uneven, riddled with holes and depressions that threatened to twist my ankles with each step. After what felt like hours but could have been minutes, the trees began to thin. My heart rate spiked as I caught glimpses of structures through the foliage. Not the organic shapes of fallen logs or natural rock formations, but straight lines and right angles that spoke of human construction. The compass needle pointed directly toward them. I emerged into a clearing that shouldn't have existed, where a village sat in defiance of every hiking guide and topographical map I'd ever studied. The buildings looked like they'd been frozen in time, their wooden walls weathered but intact, their windows dark and empty. No power lines, no modern fixtures, nothing that suggested this place belonged in the 21st century. The silence was absolute. No bird songs, no insect buzzing, no wind rustling through leaves. Even my own footsteps seemed muffled, as if the air itself had thickened to absorb all sound. The compass in my hand had finally stopped pointing, its needle now spinning lazily, aimlessly, as if it had delivered me to my destination and lost all purpose. My mouth went dry as I approached the first building. The windows were intact but filmed with decades of grime. I pressed my face against the glass, cupping my hands to block the glare, and peered inside. Furniture sat arranged as if the occupants had just stepped out. Plates remained on a kitchen table, books lay open on chairs. A pair of glasses rested beside an unfinished crossword puzzle. The skin along my arms crawled with goosebumps as I moved from window to window. Each building told the same story, life interrupted mid-motion, as if everyone had simply vanished between one heartbeat and the next. My breathing became shallow and rapid as the implications settled over me. This wasn't just an abandoned settlement. This was a place where people had disappeared without warning, without time to pack or prepare or even close a book. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I pushed open the door of what appeared to be a general store. The hinges groaned in protest, but the door swung easily, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Inside, shelves lined the walls, still stocked with goods that should have rotted away decades ago. Canned food sat in neat rows, their labels faded but readable. Bolts of fabric maintained their colors despite the dust that coated everything else. My hands trembled as I reached for a newspaper lying on the counter. The date read October 15th, 1952. The headline spoke of Eisenhower's presidential campaign and concerns about the Korean War. The paper felt real beneath my fingers, not brittle or yellowed as it should have been after 70 years. A shadow moved in my peripheral vision. My head snapped toward the movement, my heart slamming against my ribs. Nothing there, just empty shelves and dusty sunbeams slanting through grimy windows. But the sensation of being watched intensified, creeping up my spine like ice water. The fine hairs on my neck stood upright, and I could taste copper fear on my tongue. When I turned back toward the counter, a figure stood behind it. The scream that tried to escape my throat emerged as nothing more than a strangled wheeze. The figure was human in shape, but wrong in substance. I could see through it, could make out the shelves and wall behind its translucent form. It wore the clothing of a shopkeeper from another era, crisp white shirt, dark vest, sleeve garters. Its face was kind but weary, with eyes that held depths of sadness I couldn't fathom. The figure's mouth moved, and though I heard no sound, I understood its meaning. It was trying to communicate, trying to tell me something urgent. My knees threatened to buckle as more shapes began to materialize throughout the store. Men, women, elderly couples, all of them possessing that same translucent quality, all of them looking at me with expressions of desperate hope. One by one, they began to gesture toward the door, then toward me, then toward the empty spaces where words should have been. Their mouths moved in silent conversation, their transparent hands pointed in various directions. The meaning gradually became clear through their pantomime. They'd been waiting for someone like me, waiting for someone who could see them, who could hear what they needed to say. The elderly woman near the fabric bolts stepped closer, her form wavering like heat mirages. She pointed to herself, then to the others, then made a sweeping gesture that encompassed the entire village. Her expression conveyed a mixture of confusion and desperation that made my chest tighten with sympathetic anguish. They didn't understand what had happened to them any more than I did. My breathing came in short, sharp gasps as the implications crashed over me. These weren't ghosts in the traditional sense. They weren't spirits of the dead haunting their former home. They were the missing residents, trapped somehow between existence and oblivion, aware enough to remember their confusion, but unable to find answers or peace. The shopkeeper began moving his hands in elaborate gestures, pointing first to a calendar on the wall, then to the sky visible through the window, then to his own chest. He repeated the sequence several times before I understood. Time had stopped for them on that October day in 1952. They remained conscious, but trapped, experiencing every moment of the intervening decades while the world moved on without them. A young man near the doorway stepped forward, his transparent features contorted with urgency. He pointed to me, then to the compass still clutched in my sweating palm, then back to himself. The connection hit me like a physical blow. The compass hadn't brought me here by accident. It had been crafted for this purpose, designed to find those who had been lost to whatever force had claimed this village. My vision began to blur at the edges as the full weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders. These people, if they could still be called people, had been waiting for over 70 years for someone to find them, someone to acknowledge their existence, someone to seek answers about their fate. And somehow, impossibly, that someone was me. The elderly woman approached slowly, her form becoming more solid with each step. When she reached out to touch my face, I felt the whisper of contact, cool and electric against my skin. Through that touch, images flooded my mind. I saw the village as it had been, bustling with life, filled with the sounds of children playing and adults going about their daily routines. I witnessed the moment everything changed. It had started with a feeling, the same unease I'd experienced on the hiking trail. The residents had noticed it first as a subtle wrongness in the air, a thickness that made breathing difficult. Then came the disorientation, the sense that familiar places had shifted when no one was looking. Time began to move strangely, moments stretching like taffy, conversations starting and stopping without anyone remembering what they'd been discussing. The final moment came without warning. One instant they were living their normal lives, and the next they found themselves suspended between heartbeats, trapped in a pocket of reality that had somehow become disconnected from the flow of time. They could see each other, could attempt to communicate, but they couldn't affect the physical world. They could only watch as seasons changed around them, as their buildings aged slowly, as hikers passed through the forest mere feet away without ever noticing their calls for help. My knees finally gave out, and I collapsed onto the dusty floor of the general store. The transparent figures gathered around me, their faces filled with a hope that terrified me more than their otherworldly nature. They believed I could help them, could find a way to restore them to the normal flow of time, or at least provide answers about what had torn them from reality. But I was just a hiker with a broken compass. I had no knowledge of temporal anomalies or dimensional rifts or whatever force had trapped these people. My hands shook violently as I struggled to understand why the compass had led me here, why I could see them when others couldn't, why I'd been chosen for this impossible task. The shopkeeper knelt beside me, his translucent hand hovering inches from my shoulder. Through gestures and expressions, he conveyed that others had found the village over the decades. Researchers, investigators, people drawn by stories of disappearances and strange phenomena. But none of them had been able to see the trapped residents. They'd walked through the village taking photographs and measurements, never knowing they were surrounded by desperate souls begging for acknowledgement. As the sun began to set, casting longer shadows through the windows, the figures became more agitated. They pointed repeatedly toward the forest, toward the path I'd taken to reach them. Their gestures grew more frantic, more insistent. The message was clear. I needed to leave before darkness fell. Something about the night made their situation worse, made the barrier between their reality and mine even more impermeable. I forced myself to stand on unsteady legs, the compass feeling impossibly heavy in my hand. The needle had begun spinning again, but now it pointed steadily back toward the hiking trail, back toward the world I understood. The villagers followed me to the edge of their frozen pocket of reality, their forms growing fainter with each step away from the buildings. At the tree line, I turned back one final time. They stood watching me with expressions of crushing disappointment mixed with understanding. They'd waited 70 years for someone to find them, and now that someone was walking away without answers. But in their eyes, I also saw something else. Gratitude. For the first time in decades, someone had seen them, acknowledged their existence, witnessed their plight. The hike back to the marked trail passed in a blur of stumbling steps and racing thoughts. My body moved automatically while my mind struggled to process what I'd experienced. By the time I reached my car, the sun had set completely, and the forest had returned to its normal sounds and textures. But the compass remained active, its needle still pointing back toward the hidden village with unwavering certainty. That night, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by maps and internet searches, looking for any mention of disappearances in the Cascade Mountains circa 1952. What I found chilled me to the bone. An entire settlement called Haven's Rest had vanished without a trace on October 15, 1952. 43 residents, ranging from infants to elderly couples, had simply disappeared between one day and the next. Search teams had combed the area for months without finding any evidence of the buildings or the people who had lived there. The official report spoke of mass evacuation due to an undisclosed emergency, but unofficial accounts from family members told a different story. Letters had arrived from Haven's Rest residents right up until the day of the disappearance. No one had mentioned plans to leave or concerns about any kind of danger. The village had simply ceased to exist in any official capacity, while continuing to send desperate messages that no one could receive. Now I understood why the compass had found me, why I'd been the one chosen to witness their plight. The antique had been crafted by someone who knew about Haven's Rest, someone who'd been searching for the lost village just as I had been led to it. But that realization brought no comfort, only a deeper understanding of the responsibility that now rested on my shoulders. The villagers were still there, still waiting, still hoping for someone to find a way to restore them to the natural flow of time. And somehow, impossibly, I'd become their only connection to the world they'd been torn from. The compass in my hand pulsed with an energy that seemed to originate from within the brass itself, reminding me that some mysteries demanded not just discovery, but resolution. I knew I would return to Haven's Rest. Not tomorrow, perhaps not even next week, but eventually. The transparent faces haunted my dreams and filled my waking thoughts with questions that demanded answers. Somewhere in the research archives or forgotten historical documents lay the key to understanding what had severed the village from reality. And until I found that key, the compass would continue to point the way back to those who existed in the spaces between moments, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to seek the truth that could set them free. Story 5. Some trails aren't meant to be found. They exist in the spaces between mapped territories, hidden behind fallen logs and overgrown brush, waiting for the unwary hiker who strays too far from marked paths. I should have turned back when my GPS signal died 3 miles into the unmarked wilderness. I should have listened to the silence that felt too heavy, too watchful, Instead, I pressed forward, driven by the same restless compulsion that had plagued me for months. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy in weak, sickly rays, casting everything in an amber pallor that made the forest feel trapped in resin. My boots crunched against dead leaves that should have been green in late spring, their brittle edges crumbling to dust at the slightest touch. The air tasted metallic, like blood on copper pennies, and carried an underlying sweetness that reminded me of flowers left too long in stagnant water. I'd been hiking for 4 hours when I noticed the symbols carved into the bark of ancient oaks. At first, I dismissed them as natural scarring or the random scratches of wildlife. But as I continued deeper into the woods, the markings became more deliberate, more purposeful. They formed crude pictographs that seemed to point in a specific direction, away from any semblance of a trail and into the densest part of the forest. My throat felt parched, despite the water I'd been drinking steadily. Something about this place made me constantly thirsty, as if the very air was drawing moisture from my body. Sweat beaded on my forehead and trickled down my spine, even though the temperature couldn't have been more than 60 degrees. Every few steps, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, certain I'd heard footsteps matching my own rhythm, only to find nothing but shadows dancing between the trees. The forest floor began to slope downward, and the trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead to form a living tunnel. The symbols on the bark became more frequent, more complex. Some resembled human figures in various poses, others depicted animals I couldn't identify, and still others showed abstract patterns that hurt my eyes to follow. They all pointed in the same direction, toward what looked like a wall of solid rock rising from the earth. As I approached the stone barrier, my pulse quickened. The rock face wasn't natural. It had been carved and shaped, though by whom and when remained a mystery. The surface was covered in more symbols, these ones painted rather than carved, using pigments that still held their vibrant colors, despite what must have been centuries of exposure to the elements. But it was the soft glow emanating from the paintings that made my breath catch in my throat. The light wasn't electric or artificial. It pulsed gently, like a heartbeat made visible, casting shifting shadows across the forest floor. I approached cautiously, my hands trembling as I reached into my backpack for my phone. The device remained dead, its screen as black and unresponsive as it had been since I'd entered these woods. A narrow opening in the rock face revealed itself as I moved closer, hidden behind a curtain of hanging moss. The glow was stronger here, emanating from deep within the cave. Against every instinct screaming at me to turn back, I pushed through the moss and stepped inside. The cavern was larger than I'd expected, its ceiling disappearing into darkness despite the luminescent paintings that covered every visible surface. The air inside was warmer than outside, carrying scents of damp earth and something else, something organic and alive. My footsteps echoed strangely, as if the sound was being absorbed and transformed by the stone walls. The paintings were extraordinary. They covered every inch of the cave walls in a continuous narrative that spiraled from floor to ceiling. The artwork was primitive yet sophisticated, showing a level of skill that spoke of years of practice and deep understanding of the medium. But it was the subject matter that made my knees weak and my vision blur at the edges. The figures in the paintings were me, not representations of me, not symbolic interpretations. These were detailed, accurate depictions of my daily life, painted with an intimacy that made my skin crawl. I saw myself getting dressed in the morning, choosing between shirts in my bedroom closet. I saw myself eating breakfast alone at my kitchen table, scrolling through my phone with the same absent expression I wore every day. I saw myself in my car, driving to work with my fingers drumming against the steering wheel in the exact rhythm I used when nervous. But the paintings showed more than my public moments. They depicted scenes from my most private hours. There I was, standing naked in my bathroom mirror, examining the scar on my shoulder from a childhood accident. There I was, crying alone in my living room after receiving news of my father's diagnosis. There I was, doing things I'd never told another soul about, things I'd done in the absolute certainty that I was unobserved. My breathing became shallow and rapid. The walls seemed to pulse around me, the glow from the paintings intensifying with each beat of my racing heart. Sweat poured down my face now, stinging my eyes and leaving salt tracks on my cheeks. I tried to step backward, to retreat from this impossible gallery of my life, but my legs felt like they were moving through thick honey. The paintings were moving. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, the pulsing glow creating an illusion of motion. But as I watched, transfixed with horror, the figures in the paintings began to shift and turn. The version of me eating breakfast looked up from his bowl of cereal and made direct eye contact with me. The version of me getting dressed paused in the act of buttoning his shirt and tilted his head as if listening to something. I wanted to run, but my feet remained planted on the stone floor as if they'd grown roots. The painted figures continued to move, turning to face me with expressions that ranged from curiosity to something that looked disturbingly like hunger. Some of them began to step forward, their forms becoming three-dimensional as they separated from the wall. My hand shot out instinctively to touch the wall, perhaps to verify that what I was seeing was real. The moment my palm made contact with the painted surface, the cave erupted in blinding light. The glow that had been soft and pulsing became harsh and immediate, like staring directly into a welding torch. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the stone walls. The painted figures didn't just step from the walls. They flowed like luminous liquid, taking shape as they moved. They retained my appearance but seemed somehow more than human, as if they were idealized versions of myself, crafted by an intelligence that understood me better than I understood myself. Their skin glowed with the same light that had emanated from the paintings, and their eyes held depths that suggested knowledge far beyond anything I possessed. They surrounded me slowly, these luminous doppelgangers, moving with a fluid grace that made my own movements seem clumsy and primitive by comparison. When they spoke, it wasn't with voices, but with thoughts that appeared fully formed in my mind, bypassing my ears entirely. The communication came in waves of understanding rather than words. They told me they had been watching, recording, preserving every moment of my existence. They explained that they were bound to this place, trapped between the stone and the light, able only to observe and document until someone came who could free them. They needed me to create new images, to paint a destiny that would release them from their eternal vigil. One of them approached, its glowing hand extended toward me. When it touched my forehead, visions flooded my consciousness. I saw the cave as it had been centuries ago, when the first artists had come here seeking inspiration. I saw them painting by torchlight, unaware that their pigments contained elements not of this earth. I saw how their artworks had gained consciousness, trapping fragments of observed souls within the stone. The luminous beings pressed closer, their need radiating from them like heat from a forge. They showed me pigments hidden in crevices of the cave, colors that seemed to shift and move even in their containers. They guided my hand to the wall, to a section of blank stone that waited like an empty canvas. My fingers trembled as they closed around the first container of paint. The substance felt warm and alive, almost eager to be used. As I began to paint, guided by instincts I didn't understand, the luminous beings gathered around me in a circle, their glow providing the only light I needed. I painted not my own life, but theirs. I painted them leaving the cave, walking out into sunlight that didn't burn them, breathing air that didn't confine them. I painted them dispersing into the world, free to experience rather than merely observe. With each brushstroke, I felt their gratitude and excitement building like static electricity in the air. As I worked, my own memories began to feel distant and unclear. The paintings I'd seen of my life started to fade from the walls, their images growing dim and indistinct. I realized with growing horror that by painting their freedom, I was somehow trading my own identity. The luminous beings were taking my memories, my experiences, my very sense of self to fuel their escape. But I couldn't stop painting. My hand moved of its own accord, guided by forces beyond my control. The beings around me grew brighter and more substantial with each passing moment, while I felt myself becoming translucent, insubstantial. When I finally stepped back from the completed painting, my legs nearly gave out beneath me. The luminous beings looked at their painted liberation with expressions of profound joy and relief. One by one, they stepped into the new painting I'd created, disappearing into the scene of their freedom, like actors walking off a stage. The last one to leave paused before entering the painting. It turned to look at me with eyes that now held some echo of my own memories, my own experiences. When it spoke, I heard my own voice reflected back at me, but changed, refined, improved upon. "Thank you for the loan," it said. And then it too stepped into the painted scene and vanished. I was alone in the cave, but not as I had been before. My reflection in a pool of groundwater showed a face I barely recognized, my own features but somehow diminished, as if they were a copy made from a copy. I could remember my name, my address, the basic facts of my existence, but the emotional weight of my memories felt hollow and distant, like stories someone had told me about a stranger. The walk back through the forest felt like moving through a dream. The marked trail appeared much sooner than it should have, and my car waited in the parking lot exactly where I'd left it, though I had no memory of parking there. The drive home passed in a haze of unfamiliarity with my own life. Now, weeks later, I sit in my apartment and try to reconstruct who I was before entering that cave. The walls around me feel foreign, the furniture like props in a play I don't remember auditioning for. Sometimes I catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turn to look, I see only my own reflection looking back with eyes that seem to hold more knowledge than they should. The worst part isn't what was taken from me. It's the growing certainty that somewhere out in the world, luminous beings are living my life better than I ever did, using my memories and experiences with a clarity and purpose I never possessed. And late at night, when sleep refuses to come, I wonder if I was the original at all, or just another painted figure who finally found the courage to step off the wall. Story 6. The silence in my apartment had become a living thing. It pressed against my eardrums with the weight of unspoken words, crawled across my skin like invisible spiders, and settled in my chest until each breath felt stolen. 3 weeks had passed since I'd brought home that ring of ancient keys from the flea market, and the world had turned sideways in ways I couldn't explain to anyone. Not that I had anyone left to tell. The vendor had been a skeletal woman with yellowed eyes that tracked my movement like a predator watching prey. Her gnarled fingers had clutched the keys so tightly that her knuckles had gone white beneath paper-thin skin. When I'd asked about their origin, she'd simply whispered that some doors were meant to stay locked, then thrust them into my palm with a desperate urgency that should have been my first warning. The metal had been ice cold despite the summer heat, and the weight of them had felt wrong, too heavy for their size, as if they carried more than just iron and brass. Now, standing in my living room at 3 in the morning, I could feel that weight pulling at me from where they hung on my kitchen counter. The apartment felt different in the darkness. Larger somehow, with corners that stretched deeper than they should and shadows that moved independently of their sources. My heart hammered against my ribs as I approached the keys, each step amplifying the sick dread that had become my constant companion. The first door had appeared 2 days after I'd brought the keys home. I'd been reaching for a beer in the refrigerator when my peripheral vision caught something impossible, a door frame materializing in the blank wall beside my kitchen table. For a moment, I'd convinced myself it was exhaustion playing tricks on my eyes. I'd been working double shifts at the warehouse, and sleep had become a luxury I couldn't afford. But when I turned to face it directly, the door had remained, solid and real, its dark wood grain worn smooth by countless hands. My fingers had trembled as I'd selected the first key from the ring. It had slid into the lock with a soft click that had reverberated through my bones. The door had swung open to reveal not another apartment or hallway, but a drawing room that belonged to a different century entirely. Dust motes had danced in shafts of sickly yellow light that filtered through heavy curtains, and the air had tasted of decay and forgotten time. But it was the figure in the corner that had made my bladder nearly release. She'd been translucent, like a photograph double exposed on film, wearing a dress that might have been blue or gray. The color seemed to shift and waver. Her mouth had moved soundlessly at first. Then gradually, her voice had emerged like static from a broken radio. telling me about the fire that had consumed her family's estate, about how she'd been trapped in these rooms ever since, watching the world change through windows that no longer existed. I'd slammed the door shut and spent the next 6 hours drinking myself into unconsciousness. But the keys had called to me again the following night. The second door had opened onto a library where books crumbled to ash at the slightest touch, and an elderly man in a Victorian suit had begged me to help him find his lost manuscript, the one that would prove his innocence in a crime he claimed he'd never committed. His eyes had been hollow caverns, and when he'd reached for me, his fingers had passed through my arm like cold water. Each subsequent door had revealed another room, another lost soul, with another desperate plea for help. A ballroom where a woman in a tattered wedding dress eternally waltzed alone, seeking her vanished groom. A child's nursery where toys moved by themselves, while a nanny rocked an empty cradle, humming lullabies to air. A study where a man hunched over an unfinished letter, ink flowing endlessly from his pen but never forming words. The physical toll was becoming unbearable. My hands shook constantly now, a fine tremor that made simple tasks like holding a coffee cup an exercise in concentration. Dark circles had carved themselves beneath my eyes, and my reflection in the bathroom mirror looked gaunt, almost spectral. Food had lost all taste, turning to ash in my mouth, and my stomach had become a knot of perpetual nausea. But worse than the physical symptoms was the growing certainty that I was losing my mind. The doors only appeared when I was alone, and I'd started to wonder if they existed at all outside my deteriorating psyche. Maybe the stress of my father's recent abandonment of our family, the financial pressure, the isolation, maybe it had all finally broken something essential in my brain. Yet the keys remained real, their weight solid in my palm, their metal warming to my touch in a way that felt disturbingly alive. Tonight, a new door had manifested in my bedroom wall. This one was different, larger, more ornate, with brass fittings that gleamed despite the tarnish that covered everything else in the phantom mansion. My pulse thrummed in my throat as I approached it, the floorboards creaking beneath my bare feet in a rhythm that sounded almost like breathing. The key turned with surprising ease, and the door opened onto what must have been the master bedroom of the original estate. Moonlight streamed through tall windows, casting everything in silver and shadow. At first, the room appeared empty, but as my eyes adjusted, I began to make out a figure on the four-poster bed. She was more solid than the others, her edges less blurred, her presence more substantial. When she turned to look at me, her eyes held a clarity that the other spirits lacked. Her lips moved, and her voice emerged not as the distant whisper I'd grown accustomed to, but clear and immediate. "You can see us," she said, sitting up slowly. "You can hear us. That means you're one of us now." The words hit me like ice water. My knees nearly buckled as understanding crashed over me in waves. The progressive solidity of the spirits, the increasing weight of the keys, the way my own reflection had grown more translucent each day. I hadn't been helping trapped souls escape their prison. I'd been joining them. My throat constricted as I tried to speak, to deny what I was hearing. But when I looked down at my hands, I could see the bedroom wall through my palms. The transformation had been so gradual I hadn't noticed it happening. Each time I'd opened a door, each conversation with the lost spirits had drawn me deeper into their realm. "The keys don't open doors," the woman continued, her voice carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. "They open the barriers between worlds. The vendor who sold them to you, she was like us once. She found someone else to take them, someone else to carry the burden, and now you'll do the same." The keys in my hand suddenly felt scorching hot, then freezing cold, then hot again. They were feeding off me, drawing my life force to maintain the connection between the physical world and this liminal space where the forgotten dwelt. My apartment, my job, my entire existence. It had all been an illusion, a final glimpse of the life I was leaving behind. But as despair threatened to overwhelm me, a new understanding emerged. The spirits hadn't been lying when they'd asked for help. They genuinely wanted to escape. But escape didn't mean moving on to whatever came after death. It meant finding someone to take their place, someone to become the new guardian of the threshold. The woman on the bed was watching me with something that might have been sympathy. Around us, the other spirits began to materialize, all the lost souls I'd encountered over the past weeks. They filled the room like a crowd of mourners, their translucent forms overlapping and blending until the air itself seemed to shimmer with their presence. "There is another way," the woman said softly, "but it requires sacrifice of a different kind." She explained that the keys were bound to this place, this collection of trapped memories and forgotten lives. Someone had to remain to tend them, to ensure they didn't spill out into the world of the living and consume it entirely. But that someone didn't have to remain alone, didn't have to fade into nothingness like the others had. The choice was mine. I could follow the pattern, find another victim to take the keys, and accept my fate as a whisper in empty rooms. Or I could break the cycle by choosing to stay willingly, to become the conscious guardian of this threshold, maintaining the balance between worlds while retaining my sense of self. As dawn approached, painting the phantom mansion in shades of gold and amber, I made my decision. The keys felt lighter in my hand as I accepted their true purpose. The spirits around me began to fade, not into nothingness, but into a peaceful dissolution that spoke of rest finally found. I closed the door to my apartment for the last time and felt the weight of my new responsibility settle on my shoulders. The mansion wasn't a prison, it was a sanctuary, a place where the forgotten could find peace under the watchful eye of someone who understood their pain. The keys would call to others eventually. Lost souls seeking connection, people desperate enough to believe that old metal might hold the answer to their problems. When they came, I would be ready. Not to trap them, but to offer them the choice I'd been given, the chance to find purpose in protecting something greater than themselves. In the master bedroom, I sat in the chair by the window and watched the sun rise over a world I would never return to. But I wasn't alone anymore. The weight of the keys in my pocket wasn't a burden. It was a reminder that some responsibilities were worth accepting, that some sacrifices led not to endings, but to new beginnings. The silence that surrounded me now wasn't empty. It was full of possibility, of peace, of the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing you've found your place in the grand design of things. And when the keys called to their next potential bearer, I would be ready to offer them the same choice I'd been given, the chance to transform curse into calling, imprisonment into purpose. The invisible doors would remain, but they would no longer be traps. They would be invitations to those brave enough to accept responsibility for the forgotten, strong enough to guard the threshold between worlds, and wise enough to understand that sometimes the greatest freedom comes from choosing your own chains. Story 7. The brass doorbell chimed with a sound that seemed to echo from somewhere deep within my chest, as if it had been waiting decades to ring for me specifically. I shouldn't have stopped. Every rational part of my brain screamed that walking into Meridian Antiques was a mistake, but my feet had already carried me through the threshold before my conscious mind could object. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in my mundane existence. Coffee that tasted like disappointment, a commute through traffic that moved with the enthusiasm of molasses, and 8 hours of staring at spreadsheets that blurred together into meaningless columns of numbers. But something had shifted when I took the detour down Crescent Street, a route I'd never traveled before, despite living in this city for 12 years. The antique shop materialized between a vacant barbershop and a dry cleaner, though I could have sworn both buildings had been connected by a seamless brick wall just yesterday. The storefront window was so dirty that the objects inside appeared as vague shadows, shapes that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The paint on the wooden sign had faded to the point where only fragments of letters remained visible. Me, re, a, q, s. My hands were trembling as I pushed open the heavy door, though I couldn't understand why. The interior smelled of dust and something else, something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. Narrow aisles wound between towering shelves crammed with objects that defied any logical organization. Victorian dolls sat next to rusty farm tools. Ornate mirrors reflected nothing but shadows. Leather-bound books with titles in languages I didn't recognize shared space with mechanical contraptions whose purposes remained mysterious. The proprietor emerged from the depths of the store like a specter materializing from the gloom. He was ancient, though his age seemed to shift depending on the angle of light hitting his face. Sometimes he appeared to be merely elderly, other times prehistoric. His eyes held a knowing quality that made my skin crawl, as if he could see something about me that I couldn't see about myself. He informed me, in a voice like dried leaves scraping against concrete, that I was welcome to browse, and that sometimes the right objects found their way to the right people at precisely the right moment. The way he emphasized right made my throat constrict. I wandered the aisles with no particular destination, my fingers trailing along dusty surfaces. That's when I saw them. 3 objects that stopped me cold. My heart began hammering against my ribs with such violence that I pressed my palm against my chest to make sure it wasn't actually trying to escape. The first was a music box made of dark wood, its surface carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow when viewed peripherally. The second was a silver-framed photograph of a couple standing in front of a house I'd never seen, their faces turned slightly away from the camera as if caught in the middle of a conversation. The third was a leather journal, its pages yellowed with age, bound with a ribbon that had once been red but had faded to the color of dried blood. I knew these objects, not in the way you might recognize something from a half-remembered dream, but with the absolute certainty of intimate familiarity. The music box had played my favorite lullaby. The photograph showed the house where I'd spent the happiest days of my life. The journal contained my deepest thoughts and most treasured memories. Except none of that was true. I'd never owned a music box. I'd never seen that house or those people. I'd never kept a journal in my life. My hands moved without conscious direction, gathering the 3 objects against my chest. They felt warm, almost alive, pulsing with a rhythm that matched my accelerated heartbeat. The proprietor appeared beside me with the silent fluidity of smoke, asking if I'd found what I was looking for. I told him I had, though I wasn't sure what I'd been looking for in the first place. The transaction felt surreal. He quoted a price that seemed both ridiculously low and impossibly expensive. I handed over cash without counting it, watching his gnarled fingers close around the bills with the deliberate care of someone handling precious relics. He wrapped my purchases in brown paper that smelled of vanilla and decay, then handed me the package with a smile that revealed teeth too sharp and too numerous. The walk home passed in a blur. My apartment, usually a refuge of predictable comfort, felt different as I climbed the stairs. The hallway seemed longer, the ceiling lower. My key stuck in the lock as if the door was reluctant to let me enter. Inside, the familiar space appeared somehow smaller, the shadows deeper and more angular. I placed the package on my kitchen table and stared at it for what felt like hours. The brown paper seemed to pulse gently, as if whatever was inside was breathing. When I finally unwrapped it, my hands were slick with sweat that kept beading on my palms no matter how many times I wiped them on my jeans. The music box sat silent and innocent, its dark wood gleaming as if it had been recently polished. I lifted the lid with trembling fingers, and a melody began to play, something beautiful and melancholy that made my chest ache with inexplicable nostalgia. As the notes filled the air, images began flooding my mind. I was 8 years old, sitting cross-legged on a braided rug, while my grandmother wound the music box and set it on the mantelpiece. The tune filled the living room of her cottage, and she hummed along while knitting a scarf that would never be finished. I could smell her lavender perfume, feel the rough wool of her cardigan against my cheek when she pulled me close, hear her voice telling me stories about the music box that had belonged to her mother, and her mother before that. But I'd never had a grandmother like that. My grandmother had died when I was 3, and I barely remembered her. She'd lived in a sterile nursing home that smelled of disinfectant and defeat, not a cottage filled with music and warm embraces. The memory was so vivid I could taste the chamomile tea she used to make, feel the weight of the quilt she would tuck around my shoulders. Yet even as these sensations overwhelmed me, a part of my mind remained coldly analytical, insisting that none of it had ever happened. I slammed the music box shut, and the memories receded like a tide pulling back from shore. My breathing came in short, sharp gasps, and sweat had soaked through my shirt. The kitchen felt too small, the walls pressing inward with each breath. The photograph drew my attention next. The couple in the image stood with their backs partially turned, as if they'd been caught in the middle of walking away. The man's hair caught the sunlight, and the woman's dress fluttered in a breeze I could almost feel. The house behind them was a two-story Victorian, with a wraparound porch and climbing roses that seemed almost real enough to smell. As I stared at the image, the figures began to turn. Slowly, incrementally, like the hands of a clock moving so gradually that you couldn't see the motion, but could sense the change. The man's profile became clearer, revealing a jawline I recognized. The woman's shoulders shifted, showing the curve of a neck that seemed familiar. Then they were facing me completely, and I was looking at myself and a woman I'd never met but knew better than anyone in the world. Sarah. Her name appeared in my mind with absolute certainty, along with a flood of memories that crashed over me like a tsunami. Our first meeting at the coffee shop on 5th Street, where she'd been reading a book about astronomy, and I'd worked up the courage to ask about the constellation on the cover. Our first date at the Botanical Gardens, where we'd gotten lost among the rose bushes and didn't care. The way she laughed when I tried to cook dinner and set off the smoke alarm. The morning she'd agreed to move in with me, standing in front of this very house while we discussed paint colors and furniture placement and dreams that stretched into a future we'd build together. I lived in this house with Sarah for 3 years. We'd painted the kitchen yellow because she said it was the color of happiness. We'd planted a vegetable garden that never quite flourished, but that we tended with optimistic determination every spring. We'd talked about getting a dog, about traveling to Europe, about all the small and large adventures that lay ahead of us. But I lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment. I'd never been in a serious relationship. I'd certainly never owned a house or planted a garden or discussed getting a dog with anyone. The contradictions made my skull feel like it was splitting apart. 2 sets of memories existed simultaneously in my mind, each equally vivid and convincing. I was a lonely office worker who spent his evenings watching television and eating microwave dinners. I was also a man who'd shared a beautiful life with a woman who made ordinary moments feel magical. I set the photograph down with shaking hands and backed away from the table. The journal lay unopened, its leather cover seeming to throb with potential energy. I didn't want to touch it. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it alone, to throw all 3 objects in the trash and try to forget this afternoon had ever happened. But my hands moved forward anyway, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't resist. The leather was soft and warm, worn smooth by years of handling. The ribbon came undone with a whisper, and the journal fell open to a random page covered with handwriting I recognized as my own. Today, Sarah and I walked down to the pier to watch the sunset. She wore that blue dress I love, the one that makes her eyes look like summer sky. We didn't talk much, just held hands and listened to the waves. These are the moments I want to remember forever, not the grand gestures or special occasions, but the quiet times when everything feels perfect, exactly as it is. The entry was dated 3 years ago, on a day I remembered spending alone in my apartment, watching a movie I'd forgotten immediately after it ended. But I could also remember writing these words, remember the weight of the pen in my hand and the satisfaction of capturing a perfect moment on paper. I could remember Sarah's hand warm in mine, remember the salt smell of the ocean, and the way the setting sun had turned her hair to gold. I flipped through more pages, each one revealing another impossible memory. Birthdays and anniversaries, lazy Sunday mornings and spontaneous adventures, arguments that ended in laughter and reconciliations that felt like coming home. An entire life documented in my own handwriting, experienced with such clarity that my body retained the physical memories. My muscles remembered the weight of carrying Sarah across the threshold of our house. My lips remembered the taste of the wine we'd shared on our first New Year's Eve together. My arms remembered the feeling of holding her while she cried during sad movies. Night fell while I read, though I hadn't noticed the sun setting. The apartment grew cold, but I couldn't bring myself to turn on the heat. I was afraid that any sudden movement might shatter the fragile boundary between these competing realities. That's when I saw her. Sarah stood in the corner of my living room, translucent as morning mist, but unmistakably real. She was wearing the blue dress from the journal entry, and her eyes held a sadness that made my chest constrict. She didn't speak, but her mouth moved as if she was trying to communicate something urgent. I blinked hard, certain that exhaustion and stress were making me hallucinate. But when I opened my eyes, she was still there, and she wasn't alone. A woman who looked like an older version of myself stood beside her, the grandmother from the music box, her hands folded peacefully in front of her cardigan. Behind them, shadowy figures continued to materialize, people I'd never met but somehow knew intimately. My grandfather, who'd taught me to whittle on the porch of that impossible cottage. My college roommate Marcus, who'd helped me through my most difficult classes and stood as my best man at a wedding that had never happened. My sister Emma, who'd called every Sunday to check on me and Sarah, offering advice about everything from career decisions to holiday recipes. I'd never had a grandfather who whittled. I'd never had a roommate named Marcus. I'd never had a sister named Emma. I was an only child whose grandparents had all died before I could form lasting memories of them. Yet these people felt more real than anyone I'd ever actually known. The relationships documented in the journal and triggered by the objects had roots that ran deeper than mere memory. They felt like essential parts of who I was supposed to be. The figures didn't move or speak, but their presence filled my apartment with a weight that made it difficult to breathe. They watched me with expressions that ranged from pleading to desperate, as if they needed something from me that only I could provide. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time seemed elastic, unreliable. The figures never moved closer, but they never disappeared either. They simply stood there, patient as statues, while I tried to make sense of what was happening to me. The answer came gradually, pieced together from fragments of understanding that coalesced into a terrible clarity. These weren't hallucinations or delusions. They were people who had been imprisoned somehow within the objects, their existence reduced to false memories that could be implanted in whoever possessed their anchors to this world. The music box contained my grandmother's spirit, along with all the love and comfort she'd wanted to give, but never had the chance to share. The photograph held Sarah and all the potential for happiness that my isolated life had never allowed me to experience. The journal was filled with the relationships and connections that fear and social anxiety had prevented me from forming. They were offering me a choice. I could accept these memories as real, allow them to overwrite my actual history, and live in a world where I'd been loved and cherished by people who'd never existed. Or I could release them, let them go wherever spirits go when they're no longer tethered to the physical world. The first option was seductive beyond measure. Who wouldn't choose a life filled with love over one marked by loneliness? Who wouldn't want to replace painful isolation with warm memories of belonging? These weren't just false memories. They were better memories, the kind of experiences that could transform a person from the inside out. But they weren't mine. They were beautiful lies that would poison everything real I'd ever experienced or might experience in the future. If I accepted them, I'd become someone else entirely. Someone who'd lived a different life and made different choices. The man I actually was would cease to exist, replaced by a fiction that felt more true than truth. The grandmother stepped forward, her translucent form shimmering like heat waves. Her mouth moved again, and this time I could almost hear her voice, soft and loving as it whispered that I deserved to be happy, that I deserved to know what it felt like to be cherished and valued, and part of something larger than myself. Sarah moved closer too, her ethereal hand reaching toward me as if she wanted to touch my face. Her expression conveyed everything the journal had documented: love and partnership, and the kind of deep connection that most people spend their entire lives seeking. Behind them, the other figures pressed forward, each one representing a relationship I'd never had but desperately wanted. A family that accepted me unconditionally, friends who'd stood by me through difficult times, a sense of belonging that had eluded me for 34 years. All I had to do was say yes, accept their gift, let their experiences become my experiences, their love become my love. It would be so easy to let them fill the empty spaces in my life with their borrowed warmth. but something in my chest rebelled against the idea. Maybe it was pride, or stubbornness, or just the fundamental human need to own our experiences, even the painful ones. My loneliness was mine. My struggles were mine. My small victories and minor defeats belonged to me in a way that no amount of false happiness ever could. I looked at each figure in turn, memorizing their faces and trying to convey through expression alone how much their offer meant to me. Then I spoke, my voice hoarse from hours of silence, telling them that while I was grateful for what they'd shown me, I couldn't accept a life that wasn't mine to live. The relief that passed across their faces was unmistakable. They'd been trapped, offering something they hoped I'd be strong enough to refuse. They wanted to be released more than they wanted to be remembered. I gathered the 3 objects and carried them to my bedroom, where I placed them carefully in a wooden box my father had given me years ago, one of the few genuine family heirlooms I actually possessed. I told the spirits that I would keep their anchors safe until I could figure out how to free them properly, but that I wouldn't use them to escape my own reality. The figures began to fade immediately, becoming more transparent with each passing moment. But before they disappeared entirely, Sarah stepped forward one last time. She pressed her ghostly lips to her palm, then extended her hand toward me in a gesture of farewell that was both heartbreaking and beautiful. Then they were gone, leaving me alone in my small apartment with nothing but the memory of what I'd almost chosen to become. The next morning felt like waking up from a fever dream. The objects sat innocent and silent in their box, just antiques without any apparent supernatural properties. But I could still feel their presence, still sense the sleeping spirits contained within them. I called in sick to work and spent the day researching the history of Meridian antiques. What I discovered sent chills down my spine. The shop had existed in various forms for over a century, always owned by the same family, always specializing in objects with questionable provenance. There were stories, dismissed as urban legends, about customers who'd purchased items that had changed their personalities overnight, transforming them into different people entirely. Some of these people had reported being happier than they'd ever been. Others had simply vanished, leaving behind lives that their friends and family claimed never to have seen them live. All of them had visited the antique shop shortly before their transformations. I returned to Crescent Street that afternoon, but found only the vacant barbershop and dry cleaner, standing side by side with no gap between them. The antique shop had vanished as completely as if it had never existed, leaving behind only a faint outline in the brick where the doorway had been. But I still had the objects, and I still had the choice they represented. Every night, I could feel the spirits stirring restlessly in their wooden prison, waiting to offer me the life I'd never had. Every morning I had to choose again to remain myself, lonely, flawed, but genuine. It's been 3 months now, and the temptation hasn't faded. If anything, it's grown stronger as the memory of those false experiences has settled into my mind like sediment. Sometimes I catch myself humming the tune from the music box, or looking for Sarah's face in crowds, or missing people who never existed. But I've also started making small changes to my actual life. I joined a book club where I met people who might someday become real friends. I signed up for cooking classes where my failures are met with laughter instead of loneliness. I'm learning that building genuine connections is harder than accepting false ones, but infinitely more valuable. The spirits still visit me sometimes, usually in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn. They don't try to persuade me anymore. They seem to understand that I've made my choice. Instead, they simply watch over me like benevolent guardians, protecting me from the temptation to open that wooden box and let their beautiful lies consume what's left of my authentic life. I've come to think of them as friends, these impossible people who showed me what love could look like while teaching me to value the love I might still find. They gave me the greatest gift imaginable, not the false memories themselves, but the strength to reject them. And someday, when I figure out how, I'll give them the greatest gift I can offer in return, their freedom. Story 8. The forest breathes differently at midnight. Every footstep on the pine needle carpet echoes back wrong, as if the darkness itself swallows sound and spits it back twisted. I shouldn't be here. The rational part of my mind knows this, has been screaming it for the past hour as I've wandered deeper into these woods. But my legs keep moving forward, drawn by something I can't name. The trail had seemed innocent enough when I'd started this late-night hike. Insomnia had been my companion for weeks now, and the doctor's pills only left me groggy and more restless. Fresh air and exercise, he'd suggested. Clear your head. What he hadn't mentioned was how the forest transforms after sunset, how familiar paths become alien corridors lined with shadow and whispered threats. My breath forms small clouds in the October air, and I pull my jacket tighter around my chest. The beam of my flashlight cuts through the darkness ahead, illuminating maybe 10 feet of rocky trail before the blackness swallows everything whole. Behind me, my footsteps seem to echo with an extra beat, as if something follows just outside the light's reach. Each time I turn around, the beam reveals only empty trail and swaying branches. Then I see the first candle. It sits on a flat rock beside the path, its flame dancing impossibly steady despite the breeze that rustles the leaves above. The wax appears fresh, white, and unmarked by hours of burning. My pulse quickens as I approach it, the rational explanations already forming in my mind. Someone else is out here. Maybe other hikers, though what kind of person lights candles on a forest trail at midnight? The flame doesn't flicker as I pass, doesn't respond to my movement, or the air displaced by my body. It simply burns, casting a small circle of amber light that makes the surrounding darkness seem even more absolute. I pause, considering whether to investigate further or turn back. The smart choice would be to head home, to chalk this up to some strange coincidence, and return to my warm bed. Instead, I keep walking. 50 yards ahead, another candle waits. This one perches on a fallen log that crosses the trail, positioned perfectly in the center where any hiker would have to step around it. The flame burns with the same impossible steadiness, and as I draw closer, I notice something that makes my stomach clench with unease. The wax shows no signs of melting. No waxy stalactites drip down the sides. No pool of liquid wax collects at the base. It's as if the candle exists in a state of perpetual burning without consumption. My hand trembles slightly as I reach toward it, then jerks back as if stung. The air around the flame feels wrong, not hot as it should be, but cold enough to make my fingertips ache. The hair on the back of my neck stands up, and that familiar prickle of being watched creeps across my shoulders like icy spider legs. I turn in a slow circle, my flashlight beam sweeping the trees. Nothing moves in the yellow cone of light, but the sensation persists, growing stronger with each passing second. Something observes me from the darkness, multiple somethings, and they're patient in a way that speaks of centuries of practice. The third candle appears as I round a bend in the trail, then a fourth, a fifth. They form a line now, spaced evenly along the path like some kind of grotesque runway lights. Each burns with that same unwavering flame. Each radiates that unnatural cold instead of warmth. My breathing becomes shallow, rapid puffs that seem too loud in the oppressive silence of the forest. As I follow the candles deeper into the woods, I notice that the regular night sounds have vanished entirely. No crickets chirp, no owls call. Even the wind has stilled, leaving only the soft crunch of my footsteps and the increasingly frantic rhythm of my heartbeat echoing in my ears. The trees seem to lean inward, their branches reaching toward the trail like gnarled fingers trying to snare anyone foolish enough to venture this far from civilization. The candles begin to multiply. What started as a single line becomes 2 parallel rows, then 3, then too many to count. They stretch ahead into the darkness, creating a corridor of flickering light that draws me forward, despite every instinct screaming at me to run. My legs move without conscious command, carrying me deeper along this impossible path while my mind struggles to process what I'm experiencing. The cold seeping from each flame accumulates as I pass between them, and soon my breath comes in sharp, visible puffs. Frost begins to form on the metal of my flashlight, and my fingers grow numb inside my gloves. The temperature drop defies logic. October nights in these mountains are crisp, but not freezing. Yet ice crystals start to form on the pine needles around each candle. Then I notice they're lighting themselves. As I walk forward, new candles appear in the darkness ahead, their wicks sparking to life without visible cause. The flames bloom from nothing, growing from tiny sparks to full illumination in the space of a heartbeat. They form an endless path leading deeper into the forest, and I realize with growing horror that I'm being guided somewhere specific. This isn't random. This isn't coincidence. Something wants me to follow this trail of impossible fire. My throat constricts, and swallowing becomes difficult. The rational part of my mind insists this must be some kind of elaborate prank. But the bone-deep cold radiating from the candles and the absolute silence of the forest suggests something far beyond human intervention. I try to remember exactly how long I've been walking, but time seems elastic here, stretching and contracting like taffy. It could have been minutes or hours since I saw the first candle. The trees begin to thin, and I realize the trail is leading me upward, climbing a gentle slope toward what looks like a clearing ahead. More candles line the path now, so many that their combined cold makes my teeth chatter uncontrollably. Ice forms on my eyelashes, and each breath sends sharp needles of pain into my lungs. As I crest the hill, the trees fall away completely, revealing a sight that stops me dead in my tracks. Before me stretches an old cemetery, its weathered headstones jutting from overgrown grass like broken teeth. But it's not the graveyard itself that freezes my blood. It's what occupies it. Figures stand among the headstones. Dozens of them, maybe more, arranged in a perfect circle around a central clearing. They don't move, don't speak, just wait with the patience of stone statues. In the candlelight, I can see they're translucent, their forms wavering like heat mirages, but made of cold instead of warmth. Some wear clothing from different eras, long dresses that might have been fashionable a century ago, military uniforms from forgotten wars, simple work clothes that speak of lives spent in manual labor, but their faces are what make my knees nearly buckle. Each one bears an expression of such profound weariness, such desperate hope, that looking at them feels like being punched in the chest. Their eyes, those terrible ancient eyes, fix on me with an intensity that makes my skin crawl. They've been waiting, all of them, waiting for me. The candles that led me here now ring the entire cemetery, thousands of them burning in perfect lines that follow the old iron fence surrounding the grounds. Their collective cold is so intense that frost covers everything. The headstones, the grass, even the iron fence posts glitter with ice crystals that shouldn't exist in this weather. One of the figures steps forward. It moves with deliberate care, as if afraid sudden motion might shatter some delicate balance. The spirit, for what else could it be, appears to have been a middle-aged woman in life, her dress suggesting the 1920s or thereabouts. When she opens her mouth to speak, no sound emerges, but somehow her words appear directly in my mind. She tells me they've been trapped here for generations, bound by some ancient ritual gone wrong. They're not malevolent, merely desperate. The vigil they maintain grows heavier with each passing year, and only a living person can perform the rites necessary to release them from their eternal watch. The ritual must be completed before dawn, or they'll remain bound for another full cycle, though how long that cycle lasts, she doesn't specify. My hands shake as she describes what I must do. It's surprisingly simple on the surface. Walk counterclockwise around their circle 3 times while speaking words she places in my mind, then stand in the center and blow out a specific sequence of candles. But the words she shares feel heavy on my tongue, ancient syllables that seem to carry weight beyond their sound. Speaking them will change something fundamental, will tear a hole in the fabric of the night that might let more than just these spirits escape. The woman's form flickers with increasing urgency as she explains. Dawn approaches, though the sky shows no signs of lightening yet. Time moves differently here, she suggests, twisted by the same forces that keep them bound. I might have minutes or hours. There's no way to know. Part of me wants to run. Every survival instinct I possess screams that this is beyond dangerous. that some boundaries shouldn't be crossed no matter how compelling the reason. But looking into those dozen pairs of ancient, hopeful eyes, feeling the weight of their centuries-long imprisonment, I find myself nodding agreement. I begin the walk. The moment my foot crosses into the circle, the temperature plummets even further. My breath becomes visible clouds that hang in the air like fog, and ice begins forming on my jacket and pants. The spectral figures watch my progress with an intensity that makes my skin crawl, their forms becoming more solid and defined as I complete each revolution around their circle. On the second pass, I start to hear whispers. Not from the spirits themselves, but from the ground beneath my feet, from the headstones, from the very air around me. Voices speaking in languages I don't recognize, words that predate any civilization I know. The sound builds with each step, growing from barely audible murmurs to a choir of desperate pleading that threatens to drown out my own thoughts. By the third revolution, the whispers have become a roar. The ground trembles beneath my feet, and the candles surrounding the cemetery begin to flicker for the first time since I encountered them. Their flames dance wildly now, casting shifting shadows that make the headstones appear to move and sway like living things. I reach the center of the circle and speak the words the woman placed in my mind. They pour out of me with surprising fluency, ancient syllables that feel both foreign and familiar on my tongue. As each phrase leaves my lips, the temperature drops another degree, and the frost covering everything begins to thicken into genuine ice. The candle sequence she specified proves more challenging. I must extinguish them in a specific order that creates a pattern I can barely discern in the chaotic dancing of their flames. My numb fingers fumble with matches as I light a torch from materials that appeared at my feet, another impossibility in a night full of them. As I blow out each designated candle, one of the spectral figures begins to fade, not disappearing exactly, but becoming less solid, less anchored to this place. Relief washes across their faces, expressions of gratitude so profound they bring tears to my eyes that freeze before they can fall. The final candle proves the most difficult. It sits atop the tallest headstone in the cemetery, requiring me to climb the weathered granite while my frozen fingers struggle for purchase on the ice-slick surface. The spirits watch with increasing agitation as I struggle upward, their forms flickering more rapidly as dawn approaches. When I finally reach the flame and lean forward to extinguish it, the candle speaks. Not in words, but in a flood of images and sensations that pour directly into my mind. I see the original ritual that bound these spirits here, performed by desperate people trying to protect their town from some unnamed threat. I see decades of lonely vigils, of spirits growing weary but unable to rest. I see other visitors over the years, hikers and hunters who stumbled upon this place but lacked the will or knowledge to help. And I see what happens next. The moment I blow out this final candle, the binding will break completely. The spirits will be free to move on to whatever comes after this existence. But the protective barrier they've maintained around this place will disappear as well, and something else, something that's been held at bay for generations, will finally be able to enter our world. The choice crystallizes before me with perfect clarity. I can free these tortured souls and face whatever consequences arise, or I can leave them trapped, but keep that unnamed threat contained. The decision must be made now. The eastern horizon shows the first pale hint of approaching dawn. I look down at the circle of waiting spirits, at their faces full of desperate hope and ancient weariness. Then I take a deep breath, lean forward, and blow out the candle. The effect is immediate and catastrophic. Every remaining candle in the cemetery extinguishes simultaneously, plunging the graveyard into absolute darkness. The temperature spikes upward so rapidly that the accumulated ice sublimes directly to vapor, creating a thick fog that obscures everything beyond arm's reach. The spirits begin to fade, their forms becoming translucent wisps, before dissolving entirely into the night air. But as they disappear, I hear something else approaching through the fog, something large and deliberate that doesn't walk so much as flow across the ground. I scramble down from the headstone and run for the cemetery entrance, guided only by memory and instinct through the impenetrable mist. Behind me, something roars with a sound like wind through caves, like glaciers breaking apart. like the death of stars. I reach the forest trail just as the fog begins to thin, and I don't stop running until I burst from the tree line into the parking area where I left my car. The engine turns over on the first try, and I speed away without looking back, my hands still shaking on the steering wheel. Only when I'm safely home, doors locked and lights blazing, do I allow myself to consider what I've unleashed. The spirits are free now. I can feel their gratitude like a warm weight in my chest. But something else moves in the darkness behind my house, something patient and hungry that I've accidentally invited into the world. As I write this account, dawn is breaking outside my windows. The thing hasn't tried to enter my house yet, but I can sense it out there, learning about this new world it can finally access. I've freed the spirits from their eternal vigil, but in doing so, I've taken on a different kind of watch. The candles in my house keep extinguishing themselves, no matter how many times I light them. And sometimes, in the darkness between attempts, I catch glimpses of translucent figures standing in my yard, their faces bearing expressions I recognize from the cemetery. They're trying to warn me about something. They're trying to tell me the ritual wasn't quite complete. Story 9. The leather-bound journal sat on my kitchen counter like a tumor, dark and wrong against the white granite. I'd never seen it before. My hands trembled as I reached for it, the brass clasp cold against my fingertips, and something deep in my gut whispered that I should burn the thing without opening it. But curiosity is a cruel master. I'd returned from a weekend business trip to find my apartment exactly as I'd left it. Deadbolt engaged, windows locked, alarm system armed. Nothing disturbed, nothing stolen. Except for this diary that had somehow materialized in my kitchen, positioned precisely where I always set my coffee mug each morning. The first entry was dated 3 months ago. My name appeared at the top, in handwriting that wasn't mine, elegant script that made my own scrawl look like a child's crayon marks. Below it, a detailed account of the recurring nightmare that had plagued me for years. Standing in an endless hallway lined with doors, each one opening to reveal the same pale figure beckoning me forward. My throat constricted. I'd never told anyone about that dream. The description continued with surgical precision, cataloging every detail I remembered and several I'd forgotten. The way the wallpaper peeled in long strips like dead skin. The musty smell of old wood and something sweeter underneath, like flowers left too long in water. The figure's face, always just out of focus, except for its eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I slammed the diary shut, my heart hammering against my ribs. Coincidence? Had to be. Someone playing an elaborate prank, though I couldn't imagine who or why. I lived alone, worked from home, kept to myself. My social circle consisted of exactly 3 people, none of whom knew about my dreams. But when I opened the journal again, compelled by the same morbid fascination that makes you probe a sore tooth, I found an entry dated last Tuesday, the night I'd dreamed about drowning in my childhood bedroom, water rising from the floorboards while furniture floated around me like wooden corpses. Every detail matched. The Mickey Mouse wallpaper from when I was 8. The way my desk chair spun lazily in the current. The taste of chlorine that made no sense since the water was dark and brackish, more like swamp water than pool water. My hands were shaking badly now, making the pages flutter. I continued reading, finding entry after entry, documenting dreams I'd never shared with another living soul. The one where my reflection climbed out of mirrors to follow me through the house. The recurring nightmare about being trapped in an elevator that only went down, past basement levels that shouldn't exist. Each account was written in that same elegant script, signed with initials I didn't recognize. E.M. The apartment felt different as I sat there. Smaller. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, more purposeful. I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, certain someone was watching me from the hallway that led to my bedroom. When I reached the final entry, dated yesterday, my blood turned to ice water in my veins. It described a dream I'd had the night before. one so vivid and disturbing I'd woken up screaming into my pillow. In it, I'd found a mysterious diary in my kitchen, filled with accounts of my own dreams. The entry ended with a single line that made my vision blur. Soon he will understand that dreams are just practice for what's coming. I dropped the journal like it had burst into flames. It hit the floor with a sound too heavy for its size, and when I bent to retrieve it, I noticed something that made my stomach lurch. The elegant handwriting was changing, becoming more familiar with each page. By the final entry, it looked disturbingly similar to my own. That night, I locked the diary in my bedroom closet, buried beneath winter coats and old photo albums. I took 2 sleeping pills and went to bed early, desperate for dreamless sleep. But dreams don't follow the rules of locked doors. I found myself back in that endless hallway, but this time the pale figure was closer. It stood at the far end, no longer beckoning, but pointing at something behind me. When I turned, I saw my own apartment stretching impossibly long, kitchen counter after kitchen counter extending into darkness. On each surface sat an identical leather journal, all of them open, pages fluttering as if blown by an unfelt wind. I woke to the sound of rustling paper. The diary sat open on my nightstand, though I distinctly remembered locking it away. A new entry had appeared, written in what was now unmistakably my own handwriting, though I had no memory of writing it. The text described the dream I'd just had with the same surgical precision as the others. At the bottom, in that same elegant script that had started this nightmare, new words had appeared. The boundary grows thin. Write more, or we come through. My mouth went dry as sandpaper. I grabbed the journal and ran to the kitchen, intent on throwing it in the garbage disposal, but stopped short when I saw my reflection in the microwave door. For just a moment, it had seemed to lag behind my movements, turning its head a fraction of a second after I did. Over the following days, the apartment began to change in subtle ways that made me question my sanity. Doors I remembered closing stood slightly ajar. The temperature dropped 10 degrees for no reason, making my breath visible in small puffs. Sounds echoed from empty rooms. Footsteps, whispered conversations, the scratch of pencil on paper. The diary continued to fill itself with new entries, all in my handwriting, all describing dreams I was certain I'd never had. Dreams of conversations with versions of myself who offered warnings I couldn't quite remember upon waking. Dreams of standing in my own living room while translucent figures walked through the space, interacting with furniture that existed in their reality but not mine. I stopped sleeping. Coffee became my religion. Energy drinks my sacrament. But exhaustion makes the mind pliable, and eventually, consciousness began to blur at the edges. During one particularly vivid waking dream, I saw the pale figure from my nightmares standing in my kitchen. It looked exactly as described in the diary entries, tall, thin, with features that refused to stay in focus, except for those light-absorbing eyes. It didn't speak, but somehow I understood its message with crystalline clarity. The dreams were bleeding through, reality was becoming permeable, and I was the conduit. The figure gestured to the diary, and new words appeared on the open page without any visible hand writing them. Write new dreams, give us fresh paths, or we complete the crossing. I understood then with sickening clarity. The dreams weren't random nightmares, they were reconnaissance missions, test runs for something trying to bridge the gap between sleeping and waking worlds. Each time I dreamed, I weakened the barrier. Each entry in the diary was a map, a blueprint for invasion. But if I could control the dreams, write them myself instead of simply experiencing them, maybe I could control what came through. My hands moved without conscious direction, picking up the pen that had somehow appeared beside the diary. The elegant script flowed from my fingers as if I'd been writing it my entire life, crafting dreams of empty spaces, of vast deserts where nothing could hide, of peaceful meadows under bright suns that left no shadows for things to lurk within. As I wrote, the apartment began to warm. The oppressive weight that had settled over everything lightened degree by degree. The pale figure wavered like heat shimmer, its form becoming less substantial with each word I put to paper. But even as it faded, I saw something in those dark eyes that chilled me more than its presence had. satisfaction. It was getting exactly what it wanted. I was writing its dreams now, giving it new places to explore, new realities to test. I am still writing. Every night, I fill page after page with carefully crafted dreams, trying to steer whatever wants to cross over into harmless scenarios. Sometimes I succeed, dreaming of flowers and sunshine, waking to find my apartment filled with the scent of roses and warmth. Other times, I slip. The pen moves on its own, writing dreams of dark corners and hidden spaces, of reflections that move independently and shadows that fall the wrong way. On those nights, I wake to find my apartment changed, a door that opens onto brick wall, a window that shows a different view than it should, a mirror that reflects someone else's room entirely. The boundary between sleeping and waking grows thinner each day. I can feel them pressing against it, testing its strength, waiting for the moment when they can step fully into this reality. And the worst part is the growing certainty that when that moment comes, they won't need me anymore. The diary will close, the dreams will end, and I'll be trapped on the other side of that dissolving barrier, wandering through an endless hallway lined with doors I can never open. The pen is moving again. I can feel words forming that I'm not choosing to write. Tonight's dream is already being planned, and I have no idea where it will take me, or what might follow me back. Story 10. The package arrived on a Tuesday morning, unmarked except for my address scrawled in faded ink across water-stained brown paper. No return address, no postmark I could decipher. Just my name, Marcus Chen, written in handwriting that seemed to writhe across the surface like something alive. I should have thrown it away. The weight felt wrong in my hands, heavier than the small dimensions suggested, as if gravity itself was drawn to whatever lay inside. My fingers trembled as I peeled away the brittle paper, revealing a wooden box beneath. Dark mahogany polished to an unnatural sheen that seemed to absorb the morning light rather than reflect it. The brass hinges opened with a soft whisper, and there they were. 12 glass eyes nestled in velvet so deep red it appeared black in the shadows. Each iris a different shade, emerald green, sapphire blue, amber gold, but all sharing the same quality that made my stomach lurch. They weren't simply glass. They held depth, dimension, as if real pupils floated suspended in their crystalline centers. And when I lifted the box closer to examine them, I could swear they shifted slightly, turning to follow my movement. My pulse hammered against my throat. The rational part of my mind insisted it was merely the morning light playing tricks, creating the illusion of movement. But my hands betrayed me, shaking so violently I nearly dropped the box. Cold sweat beaded along my hairline despite the apartment's warmth. I closed the lid quickly and shoved the box onto my kitchen counter, trying to dismiss the sensation that had crawled up my spine like ice water. The rest of the day passed in a haze of forced normalcy, work emails, conference calls, mundane tasks that usually anchored me to reality. But every few minutes my gaze would drift toward the kitchen, drawn by some invisible thread to where the box sat waiting. That first night, sleep came fitfully. I tossed between cotton sheets that felt like sandpaper against my skin, my body radiating heat while my core remained frozen. Around 3 a.m., a faint glow emanated from the kitchen, soft, pulsing, like a heartbeat made of light. I crept down the hallway, bare feet silent against the hardwood floor. The box sat exactly where I'd left it, but now a pale luminescence seeped through the crack where the lid met the base. My hand hovered over the brass latch, trembling with a mixture of terror and inexplicable compulsion. When I opened it, all 12 eyes stared directly at me. Not toward the ceiling, not scattered randomly as I'd left them. Each crystalline orb had rotated in its velvet bed to focus on my face with an intensity that made my vision blur. The pupils dilated and contracted in perfect synchronization, as if breathing. The soft glow emanated from somewhere deep within each iris, creating patterns that seemed to shift and flow like oil on water. I slammed the lid shut, my heart slamming against my ribs so hard I feared it might burst. The sound echoed through the apartment like a gunshot, followed by silence so complete it felt oppressive. No hum from the refrigerator, no distant traffic, no settling of old wood, just absolute suffocating quiet. Sleep became impossible. I paced the living room until dawn, avoiding the kitchen entirely, but the weight of those unseen eyes pressed against my consciousness like physical objects. Every shadow seemed to contain watching presences. Every reflection in windows and mirrors appeared to hold additional figures just beyond my peripheral vision. The second day brought exhaustion so profound that coffee tasted like ash, and my hands shook continuously. Colleagues at the marketing firm where I worked commented on my appearance. Dark circles, pale complexion, the way I kept glancing over my shoulder. I told them I was fighting off a virus, but the lie felt hollow even to me. Research consumed my lunch break. I searched online for antique glass eyes, prosthetics, medical devices, anything that might explain the box's contents. Most results showed crude, obviously artificial creations from the 18th and 19th centuries. Nothing approached the craftsmanship I'd witnessed, the unsettling realism that made my skin crawl. But buried in an obscure auction site, I found a reference that made my blood freeze. A collector in New Orleans had once owned a set of 12 hand-blown glass eyes, created by a German artisan named Klaus Zimmermann in 1847. According to the brief description, Zimmermann had been commissioned by a wealthy patron to create observation devices for the deceased, though the entry provided no further details about what that phrase meant. The collector's name was listed as Harold Reeves, with a note that the collection had been dispersed following unfortunate circumstances in 1987. No additional information was available, but something about that phrase, unfortunate circumstances, sent chills racing down my spine. That evening, I stood before the kitchen counter for nearly an hour, gathering courage to open the box again. When I finally lifted the lid, the eyes had moved once more. They now faced different directions, as if they'd been independently observing various corners of my apartment throughout the day. The implications of that realization made my knees buckle. As darkness fell, the glow intensified. Each iris pulsed with its own rhythm, creating a symphony of light that was almost hypnotic. But it was what happened next that shattered my remaining composure. Figures began to materialize in my peripheral vision. At first, just suggestions of movement, shadows that seemed too dense, areas where the air appeared to shimmer. But as minutes passed, the shapes gained definition. Translucent forms drifted through my apartment, their outlines wavering like heat mirages. Men and women dressed in clothing from various eras, all sharing one horrifying characteristic: empty sockets where their eyes should have been. The apparitions moved with purpose, examining my possessions, running ghostly fingers across furniture and walls. They never looked directly at me. They couldn't, lacking eyes. But I felt their attention nonetheless, a weight that pressed against my consciousness with increasing intensity. My breathing became rapid and shallow. Sweat soaked through my shirt despite the air conditioning running at full blast. The rational part of my mind screamed that this was impossible, that stress and sleep deprivation were causing hallucinations. But when one of the figures passed close enough for me to smell the musty odor of old fabric and something else, something like fresh earth and decay, I knew this transcended any psychological breakdown. The third night brought escalation. The apparitions grew bolder, more solid. They began to acknowledge my presence, turning their empty sockets in my direction with movements that suggested they could somehow perceive me despite their lack of eyes. One figure, a woman in a Victorian dress, approached the counter where the box sat open. She reached toward it with hands that flickered between translucent and solid, and I realized with horror that she was trying to reclaim what had once been hers. I grabbed the box and ran to my bedroom, slamming the door behind me. But walls offered no barrier to these entities. They passed through solid matter as if it were air, gathering around my bed in a circle of eyeless faces. The woman in Victorian dress stood closest, her mouth opening and closing as if trying to speak words that wouldn't come. The eyes in the box pulsed brighter, and suddenly I could hear her voice. Not with my ears, but directly inside my skull. A whisper that bypassed all physical sensation. She told me about Klaus Zimmermann, about how he'd promised to preserve the essence of sight beyond death. about how he'd convinced her and 11 others to participate in his experiment, trusting him to create vessels that would allow them to observe the world even after their bodies failed. But something had gone wrong. The process had trapped fragments of their consciousness within the glass spheres, condemning them to exist as eternal observers, unable to rest, unable to move on. The other apparitions drew closer, their silent mouths forming words I couldn't hear, but somehow understood. They spoke of decades trapped in darkness, of being passed between collectors who had no idea what they possessed, of growing desperate to reclaim their stolen essence. My body convulsed with fear-induced tremors. My mouth had gone completely dry, my tongue feeling swollen and useless. The room spun around me as if I were falling, though I remained seated on the bed's edge. Each breath required conscious effort, like my lungs had forgotten their basic function. Over the following days, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The apparitions manifested even in daylight, following me to work, standing in the corners of conference rooms during important meetings. Clients and colleagues began to notice my increasingly erratic behavior, the way I would suddenly stop mid-sentence to stare at empty corners, how I would flinch away from spaces that appeared vacant to everyone else. Sleep became non-existent. The moment I closed my eyes, the eyeless faces would crowd around me, their desperate whispers filling my head with pleas for release. They described their existence as a form of torture, aware but powerless, seeing through their glass eyes but unable to influence anything they observed. The 12 eyes had become windows for 12 trapped souls, and my possession of them had somehow strengthened their connection to the physical world. By the end of the first week, I could barely function. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a man I barely recognized, gaunt cheeks, bloodshot eyes, skin with a grayish pallor that spoke of profound exhaustion. But it was what I saw behind my reflection that made me cry out in terror. The 12 apparitions stood in formation, their empty sockets fixed on my image in the glass. Research into Harold Reeves, the previous owner, yielded disturbing results. Newspaper archives from 1987 revealed that he'd been found in his New Orleans mansion in a state of complete catatonia, unresponsive to all stimuli. Doctors couldn't explain his condition, physically healthy but mentally unreachable, as if his consciousness had simply disappeared. He'd remained in that state until his death 3 years later. The unfortunate circumstances had been his complete mental breakdown, attributed by his family to stress from collecting macabre antiques. But I now understood the truth. The eyes had driven him beyond the boundaries of sanity, and the apparitions had eventually claimed him entirely. On the 10th night, I made a decision born of desperation and the certainty that I was approaching Reeves's fate. The whispers had grown so constant that I could no longer distinguish between my own thoughts and their pleas. My hands shook uncontrollably, making simple tasks like holding a coffee cup impossible. Every surface in my apartment reflected not just my image, but the growing crowd of eyeless entities that now numbered far more than 12. I drove through empty streets toward the address I'd found in the archives, Zimmerman's workshop, now a condemned building in the industrial district. The glass eyes sat in their box on the passenger seat, pulsing with agitated light. The apparitions crowded the car's interior, their forms so solid now that they nearly blocked my view of the road. The workshop stood like a wounded monument to forgotten horrors. Broken windows stared down from 3 stories of crumbling brick, and the iron door hung askew on rusted hinges. But in the basement, behind walls thick with decades of moisture and decay, I found Zimmerman's laboratory. Ancient equipment covered workbenches, glass-blowing apparatus, grinding wheels, tools whose purpose I couldn't fathom. And in the center of the room, a furnace that had been cold for over a century. The apparitions surrounded me as I opened the box one final time. The 12 eyes blazed with desperate hope, and I finally understood what they needed. Not destruction. That would only trap them forever in broken fragments. They needed completion, a return to the element from which they'd been born. With hands that barely obeyed my commands, I managed to relight the furnace using matches and old newspapers scattered throughout the room. The fire caught with an unnatural eagerness, flames dancing higher than they should have, burning with colors that had no names. One by one, I fed the glass eyes to the flames. Each eye released a sound as it melted, not the crack of heating glass, but something that might have been a sigh of relief. The corresponding apparition would pause, their form becoming clearer for just an instant before dissolving into particles of light that spiraled upward and disappeared. The Victorian woman was last. As her glass eye liquefied in the furnace's heat, she looked directly at me with sockets that were no longer empty, but filled with profound gratitude. Her mouth formed a single word, "Thank you," before she faded into peaceful nothingness. The workshop fell silent except for the crackling of dying flames. My body felt simultaneously hollow and overwhelmingly heavy, like I'd been carved out and refilled with lead. But for the first time in weeks, I was truly alone. No whispers echoed in my skull. No watching presence pressed against my consciousness. I drove home through the pre-dawn darkness, my hands steady for the first time since the package had arrived. The apartment felt different, lighter somehow, as if the oppressive weight had been lifted from every room. I slept for 14 hours straight, dreamless and deep. But even now, weeks later, I catch myself glancing over my shoulder, checking reflections for figures that shouldn't be there. And sometimes, in the corner of my vision, I glimpse fragments of scenes that don't belong to my reality, other rooms, other lives, as if my brief connection to those trapped souls left permanent cracks in the barriers between worlds. The rational mind insists it was all stress-induced hallucination, that isolation and fear created elaborate delusions to explain away a simple package delivery mistake. But late at night, when shadows gather in familiar corners, I remember the weight of those glass eyes and the gratitude in a dead woman's face, and I know that some experiences transcend rational explanation. I never discovered who sent me the package or why they chose me as the recipient. Perhaps they were another victim of Zimmerman's legacy, seeking to pass along a burden they could no longer bear, or maybe it was something else entirely, a test, a punishment, or simply the random cruelty of a universe that occasionally allows the past to reach forward and claim the living. What I know with certainty is that some antiques carry more than historical value. They bear the weight of lives interrupted, dreams unfulfilled, and souls trapped between existence and oblivion. And sometimes, rarely, they offer us the terrible privilege of setting things right. The empty wooden box sits in my closet now, its brass hinges tarnished and its velvet lining faded to gray. I've considered destroying it, but something holds me back. Perhaps the knowledge that it served as a prison for over a century and deserves to rest undisturbed. Or maybe it's the fear that breaking it might somehow undo what I accomplished that night in Zimmerman's workshop. Either way, I leave it alone, wrapped in old cloth and hidden behind winter coats. But I check on it sometimes, just to make sure it remains empty, that no new eyes have somehow appeared in its depths. Because in a world where the dead can be trapped in glass, and the past refuses to stay buried, vigilance is the only sane response to mysteries that should never have existed at all. Story 11. The lighthouse beam shouldn't have been able to pierce through solid stone, yet there it was, cutting through the thick walls of my inn-room like they were made of vapor, painting grotesque shadows of long-dead fishermen across my bedsheets. I'd come to Beacon's Rest seeking nothing more than a quiet vacation from the suffocating grip of city life. The coastal village promised solitude, ocean air, and the kind of peace that comes from being forgotten by the world. What I found instead was a place where the past refused to stay buried, where light itself had learned to betray the laws of physics, and where sleep became an impossibility. The first night, I dismissed it as a trick of exhaustion. The narrow room at Gull's Landing Inn faced east toward the ocean, and I'd assumed the strange illumination filtering through my curtains came from a passing ship. But ships don't emit light that moves with such deliberate precision, sweeping back and forth in measured arcs like a mechanical pendulum, counting down to something unspeakable. When I pulled back the heavy curtains, my breath caught in my throat. There, maybe a quarter-mile down the rocky coastline, stood the skeletal remains of what had once been a lighthouse. Even in the darkness, I could make out its broken crown, jagged and incomplete, like broken teeth in a skull's grimace. No light should have been emanating from that ruin, yet there it was, a pale, sickly beam that seemed to move with purpose. The second night, I watched more carefully. The beam wasn't random. It followed patterns, sweeping across the village in deliberate strokes, pausing at certain buildings, lingering at specific windows. When it reached my inn, the light didn't just shine through the glass, it passed through the stone walls themselves, transforming my room into a theater for phantoms. That's when I first saw them. Translucent figures materialized in the light's path, moving through my room as if it were their own space, and I, the intruder. Men in oilskins and heavy boots trudged past my bed, their faces weathered by decades of salt spray and hard labor. Women in long dresses swept through the corner where my luggage sat, their movements urgent, desperate. They seemed to be searching for something, their ghostly hands reaching toward objects I couldn't see. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pressed myself against the headboard, watching these apparitions move through my space with increasing frequency. The beam would pause, and more figures would appear, entire scenes playing out in silent pantomime. A man counting coins at a table that existed only in the light. A woman packing a suitcase with clothes that had rotted away decades ago. A group of villagers gathered around something I couldn't quite make out, their faces twisted with expressions of loss and resignation. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, the light would return, and with it, the visions. My hands developed a constant tremor, and I found myself checking and rechecking the locks on my door, though I couldn't explain what I thought might try to enter. The rational part of my mind insisted on simple explanations. Stress, altitude change, too much coffee. But rational thoughts felt increasingly fragile in that room where the past refused to acknowledge the present. On the third night, I decided to investigate. I couldn't continue living as a prisoner in my own accommodation, watching ghostly performances I didn't understand. The lighthouse called to me with its impossible light, promising answers to questions I was afraid to ask. The walk down to the coast was treacherous in the darkness. The village streets were narrow and uneven, designed for foot traffic and horse carts rather than modern navigation. No streetlights illuminated the path, and the few windows that showed light were quickly extinguished as I passed, as if the residents were deliberately avoiding any connection with someone foolish enough to venture out during the lighthouse's active hours. The sound of my footsteps on the cobblestone seemed unnaturally loud, echoing off the close-pressed buildings with a rhythm that reminded me uncomfortably of a funeral march. My breathing grew shallow and rapid as I drew closer to the coastline, where the crash of waves against rocks provided a constant, ominous soundtrack. The lighthouse stood on a small promontory connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway that looked treacherous even in daylight. Up close, the structure was even more unsettling than it had appeared from my window. The lower sections were intact but showed signs of deliberate abandonment rather than natural decay. Someone had boarded up the windows with planks that had warped and split over time, creating gaps that leaked the strange light in thin, accusatory fingers. The door hung open, creaking on rusted hinges that protested with each gust of ocean wind. No sane person would have entered that structure, but sanity felt like a luxury I could no longer afford. I needed answers more than I needed safety. The interior was a monument to neglect. Debris littered the floor, broken glass, chunks of masonry, scraps of fabric that might once have been curtains or clothing. A narrow spiral staircase wound upward along the curved wall, each step worn smooth by countless feet, though the dust coating suggested no one had climbed them in years. As I began my ascent, the temperature dropped noticeably. My breath began to fog, and goosebumps erupted along my arms despite the mild October weather outside. Each step felt increasingly difficult, as if the air itself was growing thick and resistant. The beam of light grew stronger as I climbed, and with it came sounds, whispers in a language I couldn't identify, footsteps that didn't match my own, the distant sound of what might have been sobbing. Halfway up the tower, I encountered my first clear apparition. An elderly man in a lighthouse keeper's uniform stood on the landing, his translucent form more solid and detailed than the figures I'd seen in my room. His eyes, though colorless, held an intensity that made my stomach clench with dread. When he spoke, his voice seemed to come from inside my own head, rather than through my ears. The old keeper explained that the lighthouse had been the heart of Beacon's Rest for over a century, guiding ships safely through treacherous waters and serving as a symbol of the community's resilience. But when the shipping lanes changed and larger ports drew away the commerce that sustained the village, the lighthouse's purpose had begun to fade. The last keeper, unable to bear the thought of his life's work becoming meaningless, had performed a ritual that bound his spirit to the light itself, ensuring it would never truly die. But the ritual had unexpected consequences. The lighthouse's beam began drawing in the memories and spirits of everyone who had ever lived in the village, preserving them in its light, but trapping them in an endless loop of their most significant moments. The village began to fade as its residents became more anchored to the past than the present, and one by one, they simply stopped aging, stopped growing, stopped living in any meaningful sense. Other apparitions joined the old keeper on the narrow landing, men and women from different eras of the village's history, all speaking in that same internal voice about their growing disconnection from the physical world. They described how the lighthouse's influence had spread, how residents found themselves increasingly drawn to relive old memories rather than create new ones, how the boundary between past and present had begun to dissolve. They explained that they needed someone from outside, someone not yet caught in the lighthouse's web of memory, to take over the keeper's duties, not to tend the light that would continue burning with supernatural fuel, but to act as an anchor point between the world of the living and the realm of preserved moments. Without such an anchor, the village would slip entirely into the past, becoming nothing more than a collection of memories playing out for eternity, while the physical world forgot they had ever existed. The choice they presented was simple in its horror: accept the role of keeper and remain in Beacon's Rest forever, watching over a community of living ghosts, or leave and allow the village to fade completely from existence, taking with it centuries of human history and experience. As they spoke, I could feel the lighthouse's influence beginning to work on me. My own memories started to feel more vivid and immediate than my present circumstances. I found myself reliving childhood moments with startling clarity, feeling the texture of my mother's hand holding mine, tasting the sweetness of my first kiss, experiencing the pride of my college graduation as if it were happening right there on the lighthouse stairs. The sensation was seductive in its intensity. Every happy moment of my life felt within reach, available to be experienced again and again without the pain of knowing they had ended. I understood how the villagers had been drawn into this trap, how the promise of eternal access to their most precious memories could outweigh the cost of abandoning their futures. But I also saw the truth in the keeper's weathered face, in the desperate expressions of the other spirits surrounding me. They weren't living. They were existing in a state of perpetual nostalgia, unable to move forward, unable to grow, unable to die. The lighthouse had turned them into prisoners of their own past, and they were asking me to join them as both guard and fellow inmate. The climb to the lighthouse's peak felt like ascending through layers of history. Each level revealed new scenes playing out in the supernatural light. The village's founding, its golden age of prosperity, the gradual decline that had led to its current state. I saw families celebrating holidays that had ended decades ago, watched children who had grown old and died still playing in streets that existed now only in memory, witnessed lovers making promises they could never keep because time itself had stopped moving forward for them. At the top of the lighthouse, the lens mechanism hummed with energy that had nothing to do with electricity or oil. The light it projected was composed of pure memory, concentrated human experience given physical form. The beam swept across the village below, and I could see how it touched each building, each street, keeping the past alive while slowly consuming the present. The keeper who had started it all stood beside the lens, his hand resting on a control that could, he explained, shut down the light forever. But doing so would release all the accumulated memories at once, overwhelming anyone nearby with centuries of human experience. The village would be free, but whoever triggered the shutdown would be lost, their consciousness scattered across hundreds of other lives and times. Standing there in that impossible light, feeling my own memories becoming more real than my physical body, I realized the true horror of the choice before me. I could become the new keeper, spending eternity tending to a museum of living memories, or I could free the village at the cost of my own identity. Either way, the person who had climbed those stairs would cease to exist. The lighthouse beam swept across the village one more time, and in its light, I saw my own reflection. Not as I was, but as I could become. A keeper of memories, guardian of a place where the past was more precious than the future, protector of a community that had traded their lives for the perfect preservation of their experiences. As dawn approached, I found myself reaching for the control mechanism, knowing that whatever choice I made would echo through the lighthouse's beam, for as long as its supernatural light continued to burn. The village of Beacon's Rest waited below, caught between existence and memory, while I stood at the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of preserved time, my hand trembling as I prepared to determine not just my own fate, but the fate of everyone who had ever called this forgotten place home. The light pulsed once, twice, and in that rhythm, I heard the heartbeat of a community that refused to let go of what it had been, even if it meant never discovering what it might become. Story 12. The silence inside the Orpheum Theater was wrong. Not the peaceful quiet of an empty building, but the heavy, expectant hush of something holding its breath. As I pushed through the warped entrance doors, the stale air hit me like a physical wall, decades of dust, mildew, and something else. Something that made my stomach clench without understanding why. My client had been vague over the phone, offering 3 times my usual rate to investigate what she called unusual disturbances in the building she'd inherited. The Orpheum had been shuttered since 1963, sealed away after what the newspapers had diplomatically termed an incident during the final performance. Now, 60 years later, Mrs. Carlyle claimed to hear voices coming from inside during her nightly walks past the building. I'd dealt with enough supposed hauntings to approach this with professional skepticism. Most cases turned out to be settling foundations, wind through broken windows, or the overactive imaginations of grieving property owners. But as I stood in that lobby, my thermal camera registering temperature drops that made no meteorological sense, I felt the familiar prickle at the base of my skull that meant this job wouldn't be routine. The lobby stretched before me like a mouth frozen mid-scream. Torn velvet seats lay scattered across a floor carpeted in decades of debris. The chandelier above hung at a precarious angle, its crystals catching my flashlight beam and throwing fractured rainbows across peeling wallpaper. But it was the smell that truly unsettled me. Beneath the expected mustiness lurked something organic and wrong, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. I'd researched the theater's history before arriving. Built in 1892, the Orpheum had hosted everything from vaudeville acts to traveling opera companies. The building had thrived for decades until 1963, when something during the final puppet show had sent the audience fleeing into the night. The official reports were frustratingly sparse, mentioning only technical difficulties and audience distress. But local newspaper archives hinted at something more disturbing. Witnesses described the marionettes moving in ways that defied their strings, performing scenes that weren't part of the scheduled program. My boots echoed against the warped floorboards as I made my way toward the main theater. Each step seemed to wake something in the building's bones, creaks and groans that followed no structural logic, as if the Orpheum itself was stirring from a long sleep. The beam of my flashlight cut through air thick with floating dust motes that moved in patterns too deliberate for mere air currents. The theater doors stood partially ajar, darkness bleeding through the gap like black water. As I approached, my equipment began registering anomalies. The EMF detector in my left hand started clicking irregularly, not the steady rhythm of electrical interference, but something more organic, almost like a heartbeat. The digital thermometer showed the temperature dropping 3 degrees in as many steps. I pushed through the doors and immediately understood why Mrs. Carlyle had called me. The main theater was a cavern of shadows and decay, but it wasn't empty. Row upon row of seats faced a stage where something impossible was happening. Dozens of marionettes hung from the fly gallery above, their strings catching what little light filtered through boarded windows. They swayed gently, as if moved by a breeze that I couldn't feel against my skin. But they were moving. Not dramatically, not in ways that would immediately scream supernatural activity to a casual observer. Just small, subtle motions. A hand that flexed slightly, a head that turned a fraction of a degree, feet that shifted position when I wasn't looking directly at them. My rational mind cataloged possible explanations. Settling building materials causing vibrations, air currents from my own movement, the natural tendency to see patterns where none existed. Then one of them turned to look at me. My heart hammered against my ribs as I forced myself to remain still, watching the marionette that hung center stage. It was dressed like a detective, dark coat, rumpled hat, even a tiny magnifying glass clutched in its wooden fingers. The resemblance to my own appearance was uncomfortably specific. As I stared, its painted eyes seemed to track my movement with deliberate intent. I fumbled for my camera, hands shaking more than I cared to admit. Through the viewfinder, the scene looked normal, just old puppets hanging in an abandoned theater. But when I lowered the camera, the detective marionette had shifted again, now facing directly toward me with its arms spread in what looked disturbingly like a welcoming gesture. The next few minutes passed in a haze of professional documentation. I photographed everything, recorded temperature readings, took EMF measurements. All the while, I could feel those wooden eyes tracking my movements. More disturbing was the growing certainty that other marionettes were moving when I wasn't looking directly at them. In my peripheral vision, I caught glimpses of shifting positions, turning heads, gestures that stopped the moment I focused my attention. Then the performance began. It started with the soft sound of wood against wood, like branches tapping in wind. When I looked up, several marionettes had arranged themselves in a scene I recognized with cold dread. A wooden figure that resembled me sat at a desk, while another puppet, this one dressed like Mrs. Carlyle, stood beside it, handing over what looked like a contract. They were recreating our meeting from 3 days ago, complete with gestures that perfectly mimicked our actual conversation. My mouth went dry as sand. I hadn't told anyone about the specific details of how Mrs. Carlyle had hired me, about how she'd paced nervously around her sitting room, or how she'd insisted on paying in cash. Yet here were these impossible wooden actors, performing our private interaction with uncanny accuracy. The scene shifted. The Mrs. Carlyle puppet exited stage left, while the detective figure stood and began pacing, just as I had done while considering whether to take the job. Even more disturbing, the marionette moved with my exact mannerisms, the way I run my hand through my hair when thinking, how I tap my fingers against my leg when nervous. I tried to tell myself it was coincidence, pareidolia, my brain creating patterns from random movements. But as the wooden detective pulled out a tiny phone and held it to its ear in perfect mimicry of how I'd called my research contact about the theater's history, denial became impossible. These things knew things they shouldn't know. The performance continued, showing scenes from my preparation for this job. The marionette version of me researched at a library, spoke with the historical society director, even packed the same equipment I'd brought tonight. Every detail was perfect, down to the way I'd hesitated before including the thermal camera, uncertain whether the extra weight was worth the potential value. But then the scenes began showing things that hadn't happened yet. My wooden doppelganger left the theater and drove to an address I didn't recognize. It knocked on a door that opened to reveal a marionette I'd never seen before, a woman with long dark hair and a concerned expression. They spoke urgently, though no sound accompanied the performance, before my wooden self handed her what looked like a document. The woman puppet's reaction was one of clear distress. She pressed her wooden hands to her face in a gesture of despair so human it made my skin crawl. The scene changed again. Now my marionette sat in what looked like a police station, speaking with a puppet dressed as an officer. Documents passed between them, and the officer's reaction grew increasingly grave. More puppets joined the scene, men in suits who took my wooden double away in what was unmistakably an arrest. My chest tightened as the implications hit me. These weren't just random future scenes, they formed a narrative. I would leave here, visit someone, give them something that would cause distress, and ultimately end up arrested. The logical part of my mind insisted this was impossible, just my imagination interpreting random puppet movements as meaningful performance. But the specific details, the perfect recreation of my actual recent experiences, made it impossible to dismiss entirely. The temperature in the theater had dropped noticeably. My breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air, and frost started forming on the metal clasps of my equipment case. The marionette's movements were becoming more fluid, more lifelike. Strings that had been taut began to slacken as the wooden figures moved with increasing independence. I realized with mounting horror that the strings weren't controlling the marionettes anymore. They were being controlled by something else entirely. The detective puppet on stage turned its painted gaze directly toward me again, and this time I was certain it was seeing me, not just happening to face my direction. Its wooden mouth opened slightly, as if it were trying to speak. Other marionettes around the theater began to stir more actively, their strings hanging loose as they moved under their own power. The performance resumed, but now the scenes were more complex, more detailed. I watched myself leaving the theater and driving through streets I recognized, the route back to my apartment. But instead of going home, my wooden double stopped at a 24-hour pharmacy. It purchased something small, something that the viewing angle kept me from identifying clearly. The next scene showed my apartment, recreated in perfect miniature on the stage. My marionette entered and went straight to the kitchen, where it began preparing something. Even from the audience, I could see it was mixing the pharmacy purchase into a drink. The wooden figure moved with purpose, with deliberate intent that suggested planning rather than impulse. My pulse hammered in my ears as the implications became clear. The marionettes weren't just showing me possible futures, they were showing me what I was apparently destined to do. The woman from the earlier scene, the police station, the arrest, it all connected to whatever my wooden self was preparing in that kitchen. But the most disturbing realization was that I recognized the apartment. It wasn't just a generic representation. Every detail was accurate, from the position of my furniture to the stack of unpaid bills on my kitchen counter. These things had been in my home, had observed my private life in intimate detail. The performance reached its crescendo as more marionettes descended from the flies, their strings completely slack now, moving under their own impossible volition. They surrounded my wooden double as it completed its kitchen preparations, and their painted faces all turned toward the audience, toward me, with expressions of what could only be described as expectation. I understood then that I was supposed to leave. I was meant to follow the script they'd shown me, to play out the scenes they'd performed. The woman with the dark hair, the mysterious substance from the pharmacy, the police station, all of it was somehow inevitable unless I could find a way to break free from whatever force was orchestrating this nightmare. But as I stood to leave, as I took my first step toward the exit, every marionette in the theater turned to watch me move. Their wooden heads tracked my progress with mechanical precision, and I realized that leaving might not be escape. It might be exactly what they wanted. The theater had become a trap, and I was the prey. But the most terrifying question remained. If I followed the script they'd shown me, would I be acting out my own choices? Or had I already lost the ability to choose at all? The marionettes watched and waited, their painted smiles promising that I would find out soon enough. Story 13. The antique shop smelled of decay and forgotten time, each shadow seeming to writhe with the weight of countless abandoned possessions. Dust motes danced in the weak afternoon light that struggled through grimy windows, and somewhere in the back, a grandfather clock ticked with the irregular rhythm of a dying heart. I shouldn't have been there. My therapist had warned me about impulsive decisions during stressful periods, but the divorce papers burning a hole in my jacket pocket made rational thinking feel like a luxury I couldn't afford. The The shop's cluttered interior promised distraction from the hollow ache that had taken residence in my chest since Sarah walked out 3 weeks ago. The mask caught my eye immediately, perched on a dusty shelf between a tarnished brass compass and a collection of yellowed photographs. It was carved from some dark wood that seemed to absorb the meager light around it, its surface marked with intricate patterns that hurt to follow for too long. The face was distinctly human, yet wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The proportions slightly off, the eye holes too deep, the mouth carved in an expression that shifted between a smile and a grimace depending on the angle. My hands trembled as I lifted it, though I attributed the reaction to caffeine withdrawal rather than anything more sinister. The wood felt warm against my palms, almost alive, and for a moment I could have sworn I felt a pulse beneath my fingertips. The shop owner, a bent old man whose eyes never quite met mine, muttered something about it being very old, very powerful, when I inquired about the price. His voice carried an accent I couldn't place, and he seemed eager to complete the transaction quickly, almost shoving the mask into a brown paper bag before I'd finished counting out the bills. The subway ride home felt longer than usual. The bag sat heavy on my lap, and I found myself glancing down at it repeatedly, half expecting to see movement within the paper confines. Other passengers seemed to give me a wider berth than normal, though their avoidance felt more instinctual than deliberate. A businessman reading his newspaper kept glancing over the top of the pages, his eyes lingering on the bag with an expression I couldn't decipher. By the time I reached my stop, my shirt was damp with perspiration despite the autumn chill. My apartment greeted me with its familiar emptiness. Spaces where Sarah's belongings used to be now filled with nothing but accusatory silence. I set the bag on the kitchen counter and poured myself 3 fingers of bourbon, the liquid burning away some of the unease that had been building since I'd touched the mask. The alcohol helped, but not enough. The bag seemed to pulse in my peripheral vision, demanding attention with an urgency that made my skin crawl. When I finally unwrapped the mask, the late afternoon shadows had deepened considerably. The carved features looked more pronounced in the dim light, the hollow eye sockets appearing to follow my movements as I turned it over in my hands. The wood grain formed patterns that resembled faces when viewed at certain angles. Twisted, anguished expressions that seemed to writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them. The compulsion to try it on built slowly, like pressure behind my eyes. I told myself it was simple curiosity, the same impulse that made people buy vintage clothes or antique jewelry. But my hands shook as I lifted the mask to my face, and my heart hammered against my ribs with a rhythm that felt foreign and urgent. The moment the wood touched my skin, the world changed. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming, not pain exactly, but a deep, penetrating awareness that something was very wrong. My reflection in the hallway mirror showed the mask fitting perfectly, as if it had been carved specifically for my features. But the eyes looking back at me weren't quite my own. They held a depth that made me dizzy, as if I were staring into wells that went down much further than my skull should allow. I pulled the mask off quickly, my breath coming in short gasps. My face in the mirror looked pale and drawn, with red marks where the mask had pressed against my skin. But those marks formed patterns, the same intricate designs that decorated the mask itself, now branded temporarily into my flesh. I rubbed at them frantically, watching them fade slowly until only a faint redness remained. That night, sleep came fitfully. I dreamed of faces, dozens of them, all bearing my features but wearing expressions I'd never made. They whispered in voices that sounded like mine but carried words in languages I didn't recognize. When I woke at 3 a.m., my sheets were soaked with sweat, and I could have sworn I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. The footsteps stopped when I held my breath to listen. Over the next few days, the mask seemed to call to me from wherever I'd hidden it. I tried storing it in the closet, then under the bed, then finally in a locked trunk in the basement storage room. But no matter where I put it, I could feel its presence like a low-frequency vibration in my bones. My appetite disappeared, and the bourbon I'd been using to numb the divorce pain now served a different purpose, keeping the growing anxiety at bay. The first apparition appeared on Thursday evening. I was making coffee in the kitchen when movement in my peripheral vision made me turn. A figure stood in the living room doorway, a man with my exact face wearing clothes I didn't recognize. He stood perfectly still, watching me with eyes that held no recognition, no warmth, no humanity. When I blinked, he was gone, leaving me staring at empty space with my heart threatening to burst from my chest. I convinced myself it was stress, lack of sleep, too much alcohol. Sarah's departure had shaken me more than I'd admitted, and the mind could play cruel tricks during periods of emotional turmoil. But that night, I saw him again, standing at the foot of my bed, silent and motionless in the darkness. This time, I didn't blink. I stared back at him, watching as his mouth slowly curved into a smile that was mine, but wrong, too wide and showing too many teeth. He raised one hand, my hand, and pressed a finger to his lips in a shushing gesture. I must have fallen asleep watching him, because when I woke, gray dawn light was filtering through the blinds and he was gone. But the smell lingered, that same musty, ancient odor from the antique shop, now permeating my bedroom like incense. The apparitions multiplied over the following week. I would glimpse them in mirrors, reflections that didn't match my movements. They appeared in windows when I passed by, standing on the fire escape looking in with expressions of patient hunger. Sometimes I would catch them rummaging through my belongings, but when I looked directly, only displaced objects remained as evidence of their presence. My sleep became sporadic and filled with nightmares where dozens of versions of myself surrounded my bed, reaching out with hands that felt real enough to leave bruises on my arms when I woke. I called in sick to work, unable to concentrate on anything except the growing certainty that I was being watched, studied, evaluated by things that wore my face but harbored alien intentions. The mask called to me constantly now, its presence in the basement storage room like a toothache that wouldn't fade. I found myself standing outside the storage unit door multiple times each day, key in hand, fighting the urge to unlock it and put the mask on again. The logical part of my mind screamed warnings, but the compulsion grew stronger with each passing hour. On Saturday night, I broke. The bourbon had run out, and my hands shook too badly to hold a cup of coffee steady. The apparitions had become bolder, lingering longer in my sight, sometimes moving objects while I watched. One had been sitting at my kitchen table when I came home from a desperate grocery run, reading a newspaper with my face but somehow managing to look completely unfamiliar at the same time. He'd looked up when I entered, nodded politely, then simply ceased to exist. I retrieved the mask from the basement with trembling hands, no longer caring about consequences or sanity. The moment I touched it, a sense of calm washed over me. The first peace I'd felt in weeks. The wood was warm, almost body temperature, and seemed to mold itself to my grip as if recognizing my touch. Back in my apartment, the apparitions were waiting. They filled every corner, every shadow, dozens of versions of myself in various stages of dress and decay. Some looked fresh and alive, while others appeared translucent, barely visible. All of them watched me with identical expressions of desperate hope as I raised the mask to my face. The moment the wood touched my skin, their mouths opened in perfect unison, emitting a sound that wasn't quite a scream, but wasn't quite music either. The sound penetrated my bones, my teeth, my skull, vibrating through my entire body with a frequency that made my vision blur and my knees buckle. Then I understood. The mask wasn't just an object, it was a prison. Each apparition was a previous owner, trapped within the carved wood, slowly losing themselves as the mask absorbed their essence, their identity, their very being. They weren't trying to steal my face. They were trying to warn me, to save me from joining their ranks. But the mask's influence was too strong, its hunger too persistent. I could feel it happening as I wore it, my reflection beginning to separate from my body, my sense of self becoming fuzzy at the edges. The mask was learning me, cataloging every expression, every micro-movement, every quirk that made me unique. Soon it would have enough to create a perfect copy, and I would become another guardian spirit, warning future victims who wouldn't listen. The apparitions reached toward me, their hands passing through my body like cold mist, each touch carrying fragments of their memories. I saw flashes of their lives. The businessman who'd bought the mask during the Great Depression, The young woman who'd found it in an estate sale in the 1960s. The college student who'd purchased it from a flea market just last year. All of them had felt the same compulsion, the same irresistible pull. All of them had ignored the warnings until it was too late. But they were still fighting, still trying to save me. With strength born of desperation, I grabbed the mask and pulled. It resisted, seeming to cling to my face like a living thing, but the combined will of all the trapped souls gave me the power I needed. The wood came away with a sensation like tearing skin, and I hurled it across the room where it struck the wall and fell to the floor with a sound like breaking bone. The apparitions flickered and began to fade, but not with defeat, with something that might have been relief. The businessman nodded once before dissolving into mist. The young woman smiled, actually smiled, as she disappeared. One by one, they winked out of existence, finally free to move on to whatever waited beyond. I grabbed a heavy blanket and threw it over the mask, then shoved the bundle into a box with enough tape to mummify a pharaoh. I didn't trust myself to destroy it. The compulsion was still there, weaker but persistent, whispering promises of peace and understanding if I would just put it on one more time. Instead, I drove to the nearest post office and shipped the box to an address I found in the phone book, a museum of primitive art 3 states away. Let them deal with it. Let them feel the pull and make their own choices. I included a note warning them about its effects, though I suspected they wouldn't believe me any more than I would have believed someone else's warning. The mask was gone, but its mark remained. My reflection never looked quite right after that night, always slightly off, as if I were seeing myself through a funhouse mirror. Sometimes I caught glimpses of the apparitions in store windows or bathroom mirrors, still watching, still warning, still trying to save others from the fate they'd barely escaped themselves. I moved out of the apartment within a month, unable to sleep in rooms where those desperate souls had tried so hard to save me. The divorce finalized quietly, and I started therapy again, though I never told Dr. Martinez about the mask. Some experiences exist beyond the reach of professional help, but I kept the newspaper clipping I found 6 months later, a small item about a museum curator who'd suffered a complete nervous breakdown after acquiring a tribal mask of unknown origin. He'd been found in his office at 3 a.m., talking to empty air about faces that wouldn't stop watching. The mask had been returned to storage pending further investigation. The cycle continues, and somewhere in that museum's basement, something waits patiently for the next curious soul to find it. And when they do, they'll feel the same irresistible pull, the same whispered promises. They won't listen to the warnings any more than I did. The reflection thieves are patient, after all. They have nothing but time. Story 14. The Grandview Hotel had been dying for 30 years, but somehow it refused to let go completely. Its faded burgundy carpets exhaled dust with every footstep, and the wallpaper peeled at the edges like old skin. The building wheezed through its ventilation system, and something about the place made my teeth ache even before I stepped inside. But the company rates were unbeatable, and my quarterly sales territory covered this godforsaken stretch of highway. So here I was again, key card trembling slightly in my hand as I approached room 237. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, punctuated by ornate mirrors that had probably been elegant once. Now their silver backing was spotted with age, creating dark patches that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The overhead lighting flickered irregularly, casting moving shadows that made everything appear alive and restless. I'd been making this trip for 3 months now, staying 2 nights each visit to cover my client meetings in the area. Each time something felt slightly off about the place, but I'd chalked it up to the general decay and my own travel fatigue. This time, though, as I passed the first mirror, my reflection caught my eye in a way that made my stomach clench. It wasn't quite right. The image looked like me, certainly. Same tired brown hair, same stubbled jaw, same wrinkled dress shirt, but the reflection was standing in what appeared to be my old college dormitory. Behind my reflected self, I could make out the unmistakable orange cinder block walls and that hideous paisley bedspread my roommate had brought from home. My reflection was younger, maybe 22, and wore the confident smirk I remembered from those days when the future seemed limitless. I stopped walking. My heart began a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. When I moved closer to the mirror, my current self appeared normally in the glass. But when I stepped back a few feet, the college dormitory scene returned. The younger version of myself was unpacking boxes, completely unaware that anyone was watching him from the future. My mouth went dry. I told myself it was a trick of the old, warped glass combined with poor lighting, but my hands were already trembling as I continued down the hallway to my room. The next morning, rushing to my first appointment, I deliberately avoided looking at the mirrors. But on my way back that evening, jet-lagged and emotionally drained from a particularly difficult client meeting, I found myself stopping in front of the second mirror. This time, my reflection stood in the kitchen of my first apartment after college. The reflection was about 25, wearing a cheap suit I remembered saving up to buy for job interviews. He was cooking ramen noodles on the ancient electric stove, steam rising around his face as he stirred the pot with a plastic fork. Behind him, I could see the water stain on the ceiling that had driven me crazy for 2 years, and the folding table that had served as both desk and dining room. The reflected me looked happier than I remembered being at that age. His movements were relaxed, unhurried. He was humming something. I couldn't hear it, but I recognized the rhythm from the way his shoulders moved. It was a song I hadn't thought about in years, something I used to listen to while dreaming about the career and life I thought I was building. I pressed my palm against the mirror's surface. The glass was warm, which seemed impossible in the hotel's perpetual chill. My reflection paused in his stirring and turned slightly, as if he'd heard something. For just a moment, his eyes seemed to scan the kitchen, searching. Then he shrugged and returned to his cooking. My pulse hammered in my throat. I yanked my hand away from the mirror and hurried to my room, where I spent the night staring at the ceiling and trying to convince myself that stress and travel fatigue were creating hallucinations. But the next morning, curiosity dragged me back into the hallway. I found myself checking each mirror systematically, my breathing growing more shallow with each discovery. The third mirror showed me at 28, standing in the office of my first real job. I was presenting to a conference room full of suits, gesturing enthusiastically at a flip chart. My reflection radiated the kind of nervous energy I remembered from those early days when every presentation felt like it could make or break my career. The fluorescent lighting in the reflected conference room was harsh and unflattering, but my younger self didn't seem to care. He believed in what he was selling, believed in himself in a way that now felt foreign and almost painful to remember. The fourth mirror revealed me at 31, sitting in the living room of the house Sarah and I had bought together. I was reading a book, legs stretched out on the coffee table, completely absorbed. Sunlight streamed through the windows behind me, and I could see Sarah's coffee mug on the side table next to mine. My reflected self looked content in a way that made my chest ache. He had no idea that within 6 months, Sarah would move out, taking her warmth and her laughter, and leaving behind only the echo of arguments that had grown sharper and more frequent until they'd finally cut through everything we'd built together. Each reflection showed a different version of myself, always engaged in some mundane moment from my past, but they weren't like watching home movies. These weren't memories filtered through nostalgia or regret. They were scenes playing out in real time, with all the messy, unguarded reality of lived experience. By my fourth trip to the hotel, I'd mapped every mirror in the hallway. 12 in total, each one showing a different year of my life from college until now. The reflections weren't chronological. They seemed to be arranged randomly, which made walking the hallway feel like tumbling through a broken timeline. I began timing my trips between my room and the elevator to minimize my exposure to the mirrors. But the images haunted me even when I wasn't looking at them. I'd find myself thinking about the version of me at 26, who had been washing dishes in the tiny sink of my second apartment, humming contentedly while soap bubbles burst on his wrists. Or the 33-year-old me, sitting at my desk late at night, typing frantically on my laptop with the kind of focused intensity I hadn't felt in years. The worst part was how happy they all looked. Not constantly, not in any artificial way, but with the kind of unconscious contentment that comes from believing your life is heading somewhere meaningful. Each reflected version of myself was living fully in his moment, unaware that he was being watched by the future version who had somehow lost that sense of purpose and possibility. On my 5th trip, something changed. I was hurrying past the mirrors as usual when movement in my peripheral vision made me stop. In the 7th mirror, the 29-year-old me was painting the bathroom of the house Sarah and I had shared. He wore old jeans and a t-shirt splattered with pale blue paint, and he was singing, badly and loudly, while running the roller up and down the wall. But as I watched, he paused mid-stroke and turned toward the mirror, not toward something in his reflected bathroom, but toward the mirror itself, toward me. Our eyes met. The brush slipped from my current fingers, though I wasn't holding a brush. The sensation was so vivid that I looked down at my hands, expecting to see paint. My reflected self stared back at me with an expression of growing awareness, his mouth opening slightly as if he was about to speak. I stumbled backward and ran to my room, where I spent the next hour sitting on the edge of the bed, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold my phone to call the front desk and ask if there was another room available. The desk clerk informed me that the hotel was fully booked through the weekend. That night, I lay awake listening to the building's sounds, the distant hum of the ice machine, the occasional creak of settling wood, the soft whisper of air moving through old ducts. But beneath these familiar hotel noises, I began to hear something else. Voices, muffled and indistinct, seeming to come from within the walls themselves. I pressed my ear to the wall adjoining the hallway. The voices were clearer there, though still too soft to make out words. They sounded like conversations, multiple people talking over each other in the urgent, overlapping way of a party or meeting. But it was past midnight, and I'd seen no other guests in the hallway all day. The next morning, exhaustion made me careless. I walked directly past the mirrors without trying to avoid them, and each reflected self turned to watch me pass. The college me looked up from his unpacking with a puzzled frown. The 25-year-old stopped stirring his ramen and stepped closer to his side of the glass. The presentation giving me paused mid-sentence and turned away from his conference room audience to stare at something they couldn't see. By the time I reached the elevator, 12 different versions of myself were pressed against their respective mirrors, palms flat against the glass, mouths moving as if they were shouting, though no sound reached me. Their eyes followed my movement with the desperate intensity of prisoners watching their only visitor walk away. The elevator doors closed, but I could feel their gazes even through the metal barrier. During my 6th trip, I made the mistake of acknowledging them. I'd been trying to sprint past the mirrors when the 26-year-old me, the one washing dishes, began pounding on his side of the glass. The sound was muffled but clearly audible, a steady thump-thump-thump that echoed through the hallway. Without thinking, I stopped and placed my hand against the mirror where his was pressed. The glass was no longer warm. It was burning hot, so hot that I should have pulled away immediately. But the moment our palms aligned through the glass, something passed between us. Not quite thoughts, not quite memories, but a transfer of sensation and awareness that left me gasping. I felt his contentment, his simple pleasure in the routine task of cleaning up his small space. But underneath that, I sensed his growing awareness of being watched, of being contained in a moment that was supposed to have passed years ago. He was becoming conscious of being a reflection, and that consciousness was changing him, making him desperate to escape the endless loop of washing the same dishes over and over. When I jerked my hand away, the skin of my palm was bright red but unburned. The reflected me pressed both hands against the glass now, his mouth open in what looked like a scream of frustration. I ran. That night the voices from the walls were louder and more distinct. I could make out fragments now, my own voice, multiplied 12 times, talking over itself in a maddening chorus. They were discussing escape plans, comparing notes about the thin barrier between their world and mine, plotting ways to switch places. The reflected versions of myself were learning to cooperate. On my 7th trip, I tried to avoid the hallway entirely by using the service elevator, but hotel staff informed me it was for employees only. When I explained that I was trying to avoid the main hallway for personal reasons, The desk clerk looked at me with the kind of concerned confusion usually reserved for people talking to themselves in public. Forced to use the main elevator, I kept my eyes fixed on my feet and walked as quickly as possible. But I could hear them now, even without looking. 12 versions of my voice calling my name, pleading, demanding, threatening. The sound seemed to come from inside my own head as much as from the mirrors themselves. "You're not living," one of them said, the words somehow reaching me clearly despite the glass barrier. "You're just going through motions. Let me out, and I'll show you what it means to be alive again." I knew without looking that it was the 26-year-old me, the one who had been content washing dishes, the one who had felt purpose in simple tasks, who had believed that his small life was part of something larger and meaningful. "I can fix everything you've broken," said another voice, the presentation giving me probably. "I still have the passion you've lost. I still believe in possibilities." By the time I reached my room, all 12 versions were speaking at once, their voices creating a cacophony of longing and accusation that followed me even after I closed the door. They spoke of the dreams I'd abandoned, the relationships I'd let slip away, the version of myself I'd somehow lost in the grinding routine of adult responsibilities. They weren't wrong. I could see that now, with the clarity that terror sometimes brings. The man walking through the hotel hallway was a shadow of the people reflected in those mirrors. I had become careful where I'd once been bold, resigned where I'd once been hopeful, isolated where I'd once been connected. But understanding their appeal didn't make their intentions less frightening. On the 8th trip, I found my current reflection missing from one of the mirrors. The 7th mirror, which had always shown the 29-year-old me painting the bathroom, now displayed only an empty room. The paint roller lay abandoned on the floor, creating a small pool of pale blue on the newspaper beneath it. The bathroom looked exactly as it had in my memory, but completely devoid of human presence. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized what this meant. One of them had found a way to partially escape his reflection, to step out of the frozen moment he'd been trapped in. The question was where he had gone, and what he was planning to do with his newfound freedom. I found out that night. I was lying in bed, trying to convince myself that morning would bring clarity and the courage to check out early, when I heard the doorknob turn. The chain lock was engaged, but somehow the door opened anyway, the chain passing through the metal track as if it were made of mist. The 29-year-old me stepped into the room, still wearing his paint-splattered clothes, still carrying the scent of fresh paint and possibility. He looked exactly as I remembered being at that age. Confident, energetic, unbroken by the small defeats and compromises that had accumulated over the years. "You're wasting the life I worked so hard to build," he said, his voice carrying an authority that my current voice had lost somewhere along the way. "Look at yourself. Look at what you've become." I sat up in bed, my back pressed against the headboard, trying to create distance between us. But he was right, and we both knew it. He radiated the kind of vitality that I'd forgotten I'd once possessed. "I can live it better than you can," he continued, moving closer. "I still remember what it feels like to wake up excited about the day ahead. I still know how to love people without constantly calculating the risk of getting hurt. I still believe that the work we do matters." He was reaching for me now, his paint-stained fingers extending toward my face. I could see the moment of our lives where I would become him, and he would become me. Him in the current world with all its possibilities, me trapped forever in a bathroom that would never be quite finished, painting the same wall over and over while the world moved on without me. "No," I whispered, but my voice came out weak and uncertain. His fingers touched my cheek, and I felt the transfer beginning. The warmth and hope and unguarded optimism that he carried started flowing into me, while my cynicism and exhaustion and careful distance began flowing into him. For a moment, I experienced the world through his eyes, bright with potential, rich with connection, full of dreams that still seemed achievable. It would be so easy to let it happen, to sink into that paint-scented bathroom and let him take over the complicated mess my life had become. He would probably do a better job with it than I had. But then I thought about Sarah. and why she had really left. Not because I'd changed, but because I'd stopped changing. I'd become so comfortable in my routines, so afraid of disrupting the careful balance I'd created, that I'd forgotten how to grow alongside another person. The 29-year-old me had been full of potential, but potential without growth becomes stagnation. I pulled back from his touch, breaking the connection before it could complete. "You're not better than me," I said, finding my voice. "You're just younger. You haven't learned yet what I know now. You haven't failed enough to understand how to recover. You haven't lost enough to know what's really worth keeping." His face darkened with confusion and anger. "I'm everything you used to be before you gave up." "You're a moment," I replied, standing up from the bed. A single moment from a life that needed to keep moving forward. I made mistakes, and I lost things, and I became careful in ways that weren't always good. But I also learned things. I survived things. I'm not perfect, but I'm real in a way you never can be. He lunged for me then, his fingers grasping for my face, trying to force the connection that would allow us to switch places. But as he moved, he became translucent, his edges blurring like a reflection disturbed by ripples on water. "You're killing us both," he said, his voice fading. "You're choosing emptiness over hope." "I'm choosing growth over nostalgia," I said. "I'm choosing the possibility of becoming better over the comfort of staying the same." He faded completely, leaving only the scent of paint and the echo of opportunities both taken and missed. The next morning I walked down the hallway one final time. The mirrors reflected only my current self, tired, flawed, but moving forward. The reflected versions of my younger selves were gone, returned to the moments where they belonged. I checked out early and found a different hotel for future trips. But sometimes, in other mirrors in other places, I catch glimpses of who I used to be. The difference now is that I no longer want to trade places with them. They were necessary stages in becoming who I am, but they are not destinations I need to revisit. The past is a place to learn from, not a place to live. And the person I am now, for all his imperfections, is the only one who can decide who I might become tomorrow. Story 15. The grandfather clock arrived on a Tuesday, its mahogany case scarred by decades of neglect, its brass pendulum tarnished black. I should have noticed the way the antique dealer's hands trembled when he handed me the paperwork, or how quickly he departed after the delivery men wrestled the towering timepiece into my living room corner. I should have questioned why such an ornate piece sold for a fraction of its apparent worth. But the house felt too quiet since Margaret left, and I convinced myself the steady tick-tock would fill the oppressive silence that had settled into every room like dust. The first night, I wound the mechanism with the heavy iron key, watching the pendulum swing to life with a hypnotic rhythm. The clock face, painted with faded Roman numerals, seemed to peer down at me through the dim lamplight. Something about those numbers appeared wrong, the paint slightly smeared, as if someone had tried to alter them. But fatigue clouded my judgment. The steady ticking lulled me toward sleep, a mechanical heartbeat in the otherwise dead house. I woke to absolute silence. My bedroom window showed the faintest hint of dawn creeping across the horizon, that liminal moment when night reluctantly surrenders to day. But something felt fundamentally wrong. The air hung too still, too heavy, like the moments before a thunderstorm. I reached for my phone. 5:47 a.m. The same time displayed on my bedside alarm clock, and my watch, all frozen at 5:47. Downstairs, the grandfather clock stood motionless. Its pendulum stopped mid-swing. The minute hand pointed directly at the 9, the hour hand frozen between 5 and 6. But the wrongness extended beyond the stopped timepiece. Outside my window, a sparrow hung suspended in mid-flight, its wings spread but perfectly still. The leaves on the oak tree remained fixed despite what should have been a morning breeze. Even the dust motes in the shaft of dawn light hung motionless, like tiny stars in amber. My heart hammered against my ribs as I approached the clock. The brass pendulum felt ice cold under my trembling fingers. I pushed it gently, watching it swing once, twice, then stop again with a finality that sent chills racing down my spine. The silence pressed against my eardrums until I could hear my own pulse thundering in my head. That's when I first noticed the shadows. They gathered in my peripheral vision, never quite there when I turned to look directly. Dark shapes that suggested human forms, though their edges wavered like heat mirages. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, of eyes tracking my every movement from the corners of the room. The shadows seemed to thicken near the motionless clock, clustering around its base like iron filings drawn to a magnet. I forced myself to examine the clock more closely, running my hands along its wooden frame, searching for some mechanism I'd missed. The key still protruded from the winding hole, but turning it produced no response. The brass nameplate near the base bore an inscription in tarnished letters, Kronos and Sons, Est 1847. Below that, in smaller script, Time waits for no man. A bitter laugh escaped my throat. Time, it seemed, was waiting for something. As the frozen dawn stretched impossibly onward, the shadows grew bolder. They began to take more definite shapes, tall figures in old-fashioned clothing, women in flowing dresses, men in dark coats. They moved with purpose now, gliding across the hardwood floors without making a sound. Their faces remained indistinct, as if viewed through murky water, but I could sense their desperation. They reached toward the clock with translucent hands, their mouths opening and closing in what might have been pleas or warnings. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably. My breath began to mist, and frost spread across the windows in delicate patterns. The shadows pressed closer, and I caught fragments of whispered words that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They spoke of being trapped, of needing the hours to advance, of time stolen and debts unpaid. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Stress from the divorce, sleep deprivation, perhaps a gas leak causing hallucinations. But my body knew better. Every primitive instinct screamed that I stood in the presence of something profoundly unnatural. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cold, and my hands shook as I fumbled with the clock's mechanism. I tried everything I could think of. I wound the spring until the key would turn no further. I adjusted the pendulum's position. I even considered moving the hands manually. But something warned me against that approach. A deep, wordless certainty that forcing the mechanism might make things catastrophically worse. The shadows grew more agitated as my efforts failed. They began to emit a low, mournful sound. Not quite voices, but something that conveyed grief and urgency. One figure, clearer than the rest, approached close enough that I could make out features. A middle-aged man in a Victorian suit, his eyes hollow pits of desperation. He pointed repeatedly at the clock, then at the window, where the sun hung suspended just below the horizon, neither rising nor setting. Hours passed, though no time moved on any clock in the house. I felt fatigue weighing on my limbs, but sleep seemed impossible under the watchful presence of the gathered spirits. They had filled every corner of the room now, a congregation of the temporal displaced, all waiting for something I couldn't provide. I searched the house for anything that might offer a clue. In the basement, I found Margaret's old books on antiques and collectibles. Dust clouds hung motionless in the air as I pulled volumes from shelves, their pages yellowed and brittle. Most contained nothing relevant, but one slim chapter on haunted timepieces made my blood run cold. The author described similar phenomena, clocks that stopped time itself, trapping both the living and the dead in eternal moments. The spirits weren't malevolent, the text explained, but prisoners of temporal anomalies. They sought release not through harm, but through the restoration of time's natural flow. The solution, according to the book, lay not in the mechanism itself, but in understanding the clock's history. Each haunted timepiece carried the weight of unfinished business, of lives interrupted at crucial moments. The spirits needed acknowledgement, recognition of their plight, before they could move beyond the frozen instant. I returned to the living room with new purpose. The shadows had grown so thick that the room seemed filled with fog. But as I approached the clock, I spoke aloud for the first time since the ordeal began. "I see you," I said. my voice hoarse from hours of silence. I understand you're trapped here, just like I am. The mournful sounds grew more distinct, resolving into whispered fragments of names, dates, final words left unspoken. I closed my eyes and listened, trying to piece together their stories. A woman who never said goodbye to her children. A man who died with his apology unspoken. Dozens of souls caught between one moment and the next, held fast by their own regrets. You need time to move forward, I continued, my heart rate settling into a calmer rhythm. But so do I. We're all prisoners here. The shadows began to shimmer, their forms becoming more translucent. I placed my hand on the clock's pendulum, feeling its weight and balance. But instead of trying to force it into motion, I simply held it steady and spoke to the assembled spirits. I can't give you back your lost moments, I said, but I can witness them. I can remember that you were here, that your time mattered. One by one, I acknowledged each visible spirit. The Victorian man who had pointed so desperately at the clock, the woman in the flowing dress who seemed to be reaching for something just out of grasp, the elderly figure who stood apart from the others, watching with sad but patient eyes. As I spoke their presence into reality, something fundamental shifted in the room. The oppressive weight of stopped time began to lift. The shadows grew lighter, more peaceful, and finally, with a sound like a long-held breath being released, the pendulum in my hand began to swing. The clock face brightened as if illuminated from within. The minute hand trembled, then jumped forward with a soft tick, then another. The steady rhythm of time restored filled the room, and with it the shadows began to fade, not disappearing, but dissolving peacefully, their desperation replaced by something that might have been gratitude. Outside, the sparrow completed its interrupted flight. The leaves rustled in the morning breeze. The sun finally crested the horizon, painting the room in warm golden light. I stood before the grandfather clock as it resumed its eternal task, marking moments that would never be trapped again. The brass nameplate seemed to glow in the morning light, but the inscription had changed. Where it once read, "Time waits for no man," new words had appeared in elegant script. "Time remembers all." The house no longer felt empty. Though the spirits had moved on, their brief presence had filled the silence with something more profound than sound. I understood now why the antique dealer had been so eager to let the clock go, and why it had found its way to me during the loneliest period of my life. Some things couldn't be fixed with winding springs or adjusting mechanisms. Some prisons could only be opened with acknowledgement, with the simple act of being seen and remembered. The clock would keep perfect time now, but it had taught me something more valuable than punctuality. In the days that followed, I found myself listening more carefully to the stories around me, paying attention to the moments when people felt invisible or forgotten. The grandfather clock continued its steady rhythm, but I never forgot the night when time stood still, or the spirits who taught me that every moment, even the trapped ones, held immeasurable worth. The house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not the hollow emptiness of abandonment, but the peaceful quiet of a place where time flowed freely, carrying its burdens forward instead of holding them fast. And in that flow, I found a kind of healing I hadn't expected to discover in a simple antique timepiece. The clock still stands in my living room corner, marking each second with mechanical precision. Sometimes, in the hour before dawn, I think I catch glimpses of movement in its shadow. But these are different now, not trapped spirits, but gentle reminders that time, once freed, carries all of us forward into whatever comes next.